Ancient Mapping: How Civilizations Saw the World.
In the hushed basement archives of the British Museum in 1882, amid the overwhelming collection of clay fragments excavated from ancient Mesopotamian sites, a young curator named Hormuzd Rassam made a discovery that would fundamentally change our understanding of how ancient civilizations perceived their world. Among thousands of cuneiform tablets removed from the ruins of Sippar, a city that once thrived on the banks of the Euphrates River, he identified a small, damaged clay tablet bearing what appeared to be a circular diagram surrounded by dense, wedge-shaped writing. The object measured barely 5 inches across, its surface worn by millennia of burial, yet the precision of its markings suggested something far more significant than a casual sketch. Rassam, himself from Mosul in modern-day Iraq, recognized immediately that this was no ordinary administrative record or literary text. The circular form at the center, bisected by parallel lines and dotted with small circles bearing city names, represented something extraordinary: humanity's earliest surviving map of the entire known world.
This artifact, which scholars would later designate as the Babylonian Mappa Mundi, or simply the Babylonian world map, transported modern viewers directly into the conceptual universe of ancient Mesopotamian civilization. Created approximately 26 centuries ago, during the Neo-Babylonian period around 600 BCE, this clay tablet encapsulated not merely geographic knowledge, but an entire cosmological framework, a complete theory of existence that guided one of history's most sophisticated early civilizations. The map's discovery sparked immediate scholarly debate that continues to this day. How did the ancient Babylonians conceive of their world? What drove them to create such representations? And what can these ancient diagrams reveal about fundamentally different ways of understanding our planet and humanity's place upon it?
To truly comprehend this remarkable artifact, we must journey backward through time to the scribal schools of Babylon itself, to the Reed House academies where knowledge was preserved and transmitted through generations of careful instruction. Picture the scene: a spacious room within a temple complex in the heart of Babylon, the greatest city of the ancient world, circa 600 BCE. Afternoon sunlight slants through high windows, illuminating the faces of young students seated cross-legged on reed mats, each hunched over a small wooden board holding a rectangle of fresh clay. The air carries the earthy scent of wet clay, mixed with the subtle aroma of the sesame oil lamps that will illuminate evening study sessions. The soft murmur of students reciting their lessons creates a constant background rhythm, occasionally punctuated by the sharp voice of the master scribe correcting a poorly formed sign or praising exceptional work. These scribal schools, called edubas or tablet houses, represented the pinnacle of Mesopotamian intellectual life. Entry into such institutions marked a family's elevated social status, for literacy was a rare and precious commodity in the ancient world. Perhaps 1% of the population could read and write, making scribes essential intermediaries between the divine realm of written knowledge and the illiterate masses. The curriculum was rigorous and comprehensive, beginning with endless copying of syllabaries and sign lists, advancing through mathematical tables and legal formulae, and eventually reaching the most sophisticated genres: medical texts, astronomical observations, literary epics, and cartographic representations of the world itself. Our narrative focuses on one particular scribe, a master cartographer named Nabu Shuma Ishkan, whose name translates as Nabu has established a name, invoking the Babylonian god of wisdom and writing. Nabu Shuma Ishkan belonged to a family of temple scribes stretching back generations, each inheriting not only the technical skills of cuneiform writing, but also the accumulated geographic and astronomical knowledge of their ancestors. On this particular day, he has been commissioned by the temple administration to create a world map, a summary of geographic knowledge that will serve both as a teaching tool for advanced students and as a reference document for temple archives. Such maps were not created casually. Each represented weeks of careful work and drew upon centuries of accumulated knowledge. The process began with the clay itself, for not just any mud would suffice for important documents. Temple scribes used a specific mixture: fine alluvial clay from the riverbanks, carefully cleaned of organic matter and stones, blended with water to achieve perfect plasticity. Too wet, and the clay would distort when inscribed. Too dry, and the stylus would tear rather than press clean wedges. Experienced scribes knew the proper consistency by feel, testing the clay's redress by pressing a thumb into its surface and observing how quickly the impression retained its shape. For a world map, Nabu Shuma Ishkun selected an especially fine clay, kneading it thoroughly to eliminate air bubbles that might cause cracks during drying or firing, then shaping it into a round tablet approximately 6 inches in diameter and an inch thick at the center, tapering slightly toward the edges. Before making a single mark on this prepared surface, the scribe spent considerable time consulting reference materials. Spread before him on a low table were several existing tablets, merchant itineraries listing cities and the distances between them measured in travel days, astronomical diaries recording celestial phenomena, and most importantly, copies of earlier world maps from which he would work. Mesopotamian scholarship was fundamentally conservative, each generation carefully preserving and transmitting the knowledge of their predecessors. Innovation occurred, but always within a framework of respect for ancient wisdom. Nabu Shuma Ishkun was not inventing a new conception of the world, but rather creating a new exemplar of an established tradition, one that stretched back perhaps centuries into Mesopotamian history, though earlier examples had long since crumbled to dust or remained buried in ruins yet to be excavated.
The cosmological framework that guided his work was well established in Babylonian religious and scholarly tradition. The world, as any educated Babylonian knew, consisted fundamentally of a large circular disk of earth surrounded by a vast ocean called the Bitter River, or Maratu in Akkadian, the Semitic language of Babylonian scribes. This was an arbitrary mythology, but a rational interpretation of observable phenomena. Travelers who journeyed far enough in any direction eventually reached the sea. Therefore, it seemed logical that the world disk was entirely surrounded by water. Beyond this encircling ocean lay outer regions of mystery, legendary lands touched on in ancient epics and mythological accounts, but beyond the reach of ordinary human travel. The Earth disk itself floated upon the subterranean waters of the Apsu, the freshwater abyss, realm of Ea, god of wisdom. Below this stretched the underworld, Erkala, realm of the dead, while above arched the solid dome of heaven, its surface decorated with stars, which were themselves considered to be divine beings or heavenly writing inscribed by the gods.
Within this cosmological framework, Nabu Shuma Ishkun began his careful work. Using a reed stylus cut at an angle to produce the characteristic wedge-shaped impressions of cuneiform writing, he first inscribed a perfect circle at the center of the tablet, approximately 3 inches in diameter. This circle represented the entire known world, the civilized lands accessible to Babylonian knowledge. The precision required for this seemingly simple act should not be underestimated. Creating a clean, symmetrical circle on damp clay without any rigid template demanded a steady hand guided by years of practice. Within this circle, he then drew 2 parallel lines running from top to bottom, representing the Euphrates River, the great artery of Mesopotamian civilization, flowing from the mountains of the north to the marshlands of the south, where it merged with the sea. Next came the most important element, Babylon itself, marked with a rectangle at the center of the disk world. This placement was not mere local pride, but reflected a fundamental truth of Babylonian political and religious ideology. Babylon was indeed the center of the world, the dwelling place of Marduk, supreme god of the Babylonian pantheon, who had established order from chaos and fixed the boundaries of creation. The great ziggurat Etemenanki, the Tower of Babel of biblical tradition, represented the cosmic axis, the point where heaven and earth met, where divine and mortal realms intersected. To place Babylon anywhere but the center would be to deny this fundamental theological and political reality. The city's very name, Bab Elim in Akkadian, meant Gate of God, marking it as the portal through which divine will entered the mortal world. Around Babylon, Nabu Shuma Ishkun carefully marked other significant locations with small circles, each accompanied by a label in cuneiform script. Assyria to the north, great rival and sometimes overlord of Babylon. Susa to the east, capital of Elam, wealthy city of ancient civilization. Dare,
Bit Yakin, and other cities whose names survive on the tablet, each represented according to its geographic relationship to Babylon, though not to precise scale in the modern cartographic sense. The purpose of this map was not to enable point-to-point navigation, but rather to present a coherent picture of the world's structure, showing the relationship between places within the divinely ordered cosmos. It was simultaneously a geographic reference, a political statement of Babylonian centrality, and a religious diagram of cosmic order.
Beyond the circle of the known world, Nabu Shuma Ishkun inscribed another circle, this one representing the Bitter River, the world-encircling ocean. The space between the inner circle of Earth and the outer circle of the tablet's edge was carefully divided into sections, creating triangular regions jutting outward like the petals of a flower or the rays of a stylized star. 7 of these triangular regions were inscribed on the original tablet, though the lower portion is damaged, and more may have existed. Each triangle represented one of the outer regions, distant lands of legend and mystery beyond the ocean's barrier. Here, the map moved from geographic documentation into the realm of mythology and traditional lore. Brief cuneiform inscriptions accompanying each triangle describe these outer regions in tantalizingly fragmentary terms.
One outer region is described as a place where the sun is not seen, a land of perpetual darkness perhaps, representing the far north beyond the horizon. Another mentions horned bulls, possibly referring to wild auroch populations in distant steppes, or perhaps mythological creatures. A third describes a place where the heavenly ocean meets the earthly ocean, suggesting regions at the very edge of existence where cosmic boundaries became permeable. These descriptions drew on ancient Mesopotamian epic literature, particularly the Epic of Gilgamesh, in which the hero Gilgamesh journeys to the ends of the earth seeking immortality, crossing the waters of death to reach the distant land where Utnapishtim, survivor of the Great Flood, dwells in eternal life. The outer regions of the world map thus connected geographic knowledge with literary tradition, suggesting that the map served not only practical but also cultural and educational purposes, helping students understand the relationship between geographic reality and mythological heritage.
The creation of such a map required not just artistic skill, but also substantial mathematical and astronomical knowledge. Babylonian scholars were among the most sophisticated mathematicians of the ancient world, having developed a sexagesimal number system based on the number 60 that survives today in our division of hours into 60 minutes and circles into 360 degrees. They calculated complex algebraic problems, understood geometric relationships, and maintained detailed astronomical records spanning centuries. These mathematical capabilities enabled Babylonian scholars to calculate distances, predict celestial events, and manage the complex administrative apparatus of empire. When merchants traveled from Babylon to distant cities, they required knowledge of routes, distances, available resources, and political conditions. The temple and palace bureaucracies that commissioned maps like Nabu Shuma Ishkan's relied on such geographic knowledge for military campaigns, tax collection, and diplomatic communications.
Yet we must be careful not to impose modern expectations onto ancient cartography. The Babylonian world map was not designed for navigation in the way a modern map serves sailors or travelers. Its purpose was more comprehensive and philosophical, to present a coherent model of cosmic structure, showing how the known world fit within the larger divine order. The lack of precise scale, the schematic representation of geographic features, and the inclusion of mythological regions beyond the ocean all indicate that this was what we might call a cosmographic rather than strictly geographic document. It answered fundamental questions. What is the shape of the world? What lies at its center? What are its boundaries? What lies beyond? These were not merely practical questions, but existential ones, addressing humanity's place within creation. As Nabu Shuma Ishkun carefully pressed his stylus into the clay, forming the hundreds of tiny wedges that composed each cuneiform sign, he was participating in a tradition that stretched back nearly 3,000 years. The cuneiform writing system had been invented around 3200 BCE by the Sumerians, the earlier civilization that had dominated southern Mesopotamia before the rise of Akkadian-speaking peoples like the Babylonians.
Originally developed for administrative record-keeping, cuneiform had evolved into a flexible system capable of recording multiple languages and complex ideas, ranging from palace receipts to philosophical speculation. The physical act of writing cuneiform required significant training. The angle of the stylus, the depth of pressure, the spacing between signs all had to be precisely controlled to produce legible text. Poor technique resulted in muddy, indistinct signs that could lead to misreadings with potentially serious consequences in legal or administrative documents.
The scribal profession carried substantial prestige and responsibility in Mesopotamian society. Scribes served as accountants, legal witnesses, diplomatic envoys, medical practitioners, and scholars. They alone could interpret the vast corpus of written knowledge accumulated over millennia. Law codes, mathematical tables, medical prescriptions, astronomical observations, religious rituals, literary works, and historical chronicles. This knowledge was literally inscribed in the landscape of Mesopotamia, stored in the great archive rooms of temples and palaces where tens of thousands of clay tablets lined the walls. The library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, capital of the Assyrian Empire just a few decades before Nabu-shuma-ishkun's time, contained over 30,000 tablets covering every branch of ancient knowledge. Scribes were the guardians and transmitters of this accumulated wisdom, and their careful work ensured that knowledge survived even when cities fell and dynasties ended.
As evening approached and the quality of natural light declined, Nabu-shuma-ishkun carefully examined his work. The main features of the map were complete: the circular earth disk bisected by the Euphrates, Babylon at the center surrounded by other significant locations, the bitter river encircling all, and the mysterious outer regions extending beyond. Now came the extensive textual component. Around the edges of the tablet and in any available space within the diagram itself, he inscribed detailed cuneiform text explaining the features shown, providing measurements, and describing the characteristics of various regions. This text was crucial, for the diagram alone could not convey all necessary information. Ancient maps generally combined visual and textual elements far more than modern maps, which rely primarily on visual symbols with minimal text. The cuneiform inscriptions on the Babylonian world map provided context, measurement, and mythological background essential for proper interpretation.
One particularly interesting aspect of the textual component describes the distances to various regions. The Babylonians measured distance primarily in terms of travel time rather than abstract units. A journey might be described as 7 days' travel or a month's journey. Practical measurements that reflected actual human experience rather than geometric abstraction. This travel time measurement system made perfect sense in a world where walking, donkey caravan, or boat travel were the only options, and where actual travel time varied considerably based on terrain, season, and political conditions. A route that took 7 days in favorable conditions might require 3 weeks during spring floods, or if security problems necessitated long detours. Experienced merchants and military commanders understood these variables and planned accordingly, consulting geographic knowledge preserved in texts like Nabu-shuma-ishkun's map.
The physical process of completing the tablet required several more days. Once the inscription was complete, the tablet needed to dry slowly and evenly to prevent cracking. Scribes placed fresh tablets in shaded areas with good air circulation, turning them periodically to ensure uniform drying. Some tablets, particularly important documents intended for long-term preservation, were then fired in kilns, a process that rendered them nearly indestructible. The Babylonian world map that survives today was almost certainly fired, which is precisely why it endured 26 centuries of burial to emerge nearly intact in the late 19th century. Unfired tablets, though adequate for temporary documents, gradually dissolved back into mud if exposed to moisture, were simply crumbled with age and handling.
To understand the Babylonian worldview represented in this map, we must recognize that the flat Earth model reflected not ignorance, but a rational interpretation of observable phenomena within their cultural and religious framework. Consider the evidence available to an ancient observer. The Earth certainly appears flat in most inhabited regions of Mesopotamia, which is largely an alluvial plain with gentle topography. The horizon appears as a circle surrounding the observer, suggesting a disc-shaped world. The sun, moon, and stars appear to move across the sky as if traveling over a dome-like heaven. When one sails into the Mediterranean Sea, Caspian Sea, or Persian Gulf, the water extends to the horizon in all directions, suggesting that the world is indeed surrounded by ocean. These observations, combined with traditional religious cosmology passed down through generations, created a coherent model of cosmic structure.
Moreover, the Babylonian cosmos was not a simplistic or primitive conception, but rather a sophisticated theoretical framework that successfully integrated diverse types of knowledge: practical geographic information gathered through centuries of trade and military campaigns, astronomical observations of exceptional precision and sophistication, mathematical calculations of time and distance, religious mythology explaining cosmic origins and structure, and political ideology affirming Babylon's central importance. This integration of knowledge domains into a unified worldview represented a significant intellectual achievement, providing a framework within which Babylonian civilization could understand and navigate both physical and conceptual space.
The religious and mythological dimensions of Babylonian cosmology were especially important. The great creation epic, Enuma Elish, recited annually during the New Year festival, described how the god Marduk established cosmic order by defeating Tiamat, the primordial goddess of saltwater and chaos. From Tiamat's corpse, Marduk fashioned the world, creating the earth disk, establishing the celestial bodies in their courses, and fixing the boundaries between different cosmic realms. This mythological account served multiple functions. It explained cosmic origins, legitimized Marduk's supremacy, and by extension Babylon's political dominance, provided a ritual framework for seasonal renewal, and established a conceptual structure for understanding the world's geography. When Nabu-shuma-ishkan placed Babylon at the center of his world map, he was not making an arbitrary cartographic choice, but rather mapping divine order as revealed in sacred tradition.
Babylonian astronomical knowledge was remarkably advanced and provided crucial support for their worldview. For centuries, temple scholars maintained continuous observation of celestial phenomena, recording their observations on clay tablets called astronomical diaries. These records documented the positions and movements of planets, the phases of the moon, eclipses, and unusual celestial events like comets. Over time, Babylonian astronomers recognized regular patterns in celestial movements, enabling them to predict eclipses and planetary positions with considerable accuracy. This astronomical knowledge served both practical purposes, enabling the creation of accurate calendars essential for agricultural planning and religious festivals, and astrological purposes, for Babylonian scholars believed that celestial phenomena provided divine omens regarding earthly events. The integration of astronomical observation with geographic knowledge created a comprehensive understanding of cosmic structure in which earth and heaven formed parts of an interconnected, divinely ordered whole.
The daily life of a Babylonian scribe like Nabu-shuma-ishkan was structured by this integration of intellectual and religious activities. His day began at dawn with ritual washing and prayers to Nabu, patron god of scribes and wisdom. Breakfast consisted of barley bread, dates, and weak beer, the staple beverage of Mesopotamia, where water quality was often uncertain. The morning hours, when light was good and the heat not yet oppressive, were devoted to the most demanding work, creating new tablets, teaching advanced students, or consulting difficult reference texts. Midday brought a break during the worst heat, time for a light meal and rest in the shade of the courtyard. Afternoon sessions focused on administrative tasks, copying routine documents or supervising junior students. Evening, after a simple dinner, might bring scholarly discussions with fellow scribes, personal reading of literary tablets by oil lamplight, or astronomical observations from the temple's roof terrace.
The scribal profession was not just a job, but a vocation and identity transmitted from father to son across generations. Scribal families formed an intellectual elite who intermarried, maintained professional networks spanning different cities, and jealously guarded their specialized knowledge. A young boy entering scribal training, typically around age 7, faced more than a decade of intensive education before qualifying as a junior scribe. The early years were dominated by rote memorization and endless copying of syllabaries and sign lists, mind-numbingly tedious work that nevertheless built the muscle memory and sign recognition essential for fluent writing. Progress was marked by advancing through increasingly complex text genres, letters, legal documents, mathematical problems, literary works, and finally specialized technical texts in fields like medicine, astronomy, or cartography.
Only the most talented and dedicated students mastered all these domains, qualifying as the umanu, or scholar scribes, who served as advisors to kings and managed the great temple libraries.
The importance of geographic knowledge in Mesopotamian civilization extended far beyond abstract intellectual interest. The region's political structure consisted of numerous city-states competing for resources, trade routes, and political dominance. Successful rulers needed detailed knowledge of geography for military campaigns, which routes armies could traverse, where water sources existed, which mountain passes remained open in winter, where bridges or fords crossed rivers, and how long provisions need to last for journeys to distant regions. Merchants required similar knowledge for organizing trade caravans. The great empires that dominated Mesopotamian history, Akkad, Ur-III, Assyria, and Babylon itself, all relied on geographic knowledge for administrative purposes, establishing provincial governments, collecting taxes, maintaining roads, and coordinating the flow of goods and information across vast territories.
Trade was particularly important for Mesopotamia, which, despite its agricultural wealth, lacked many essential resources. Timber, suitable for construction, came from the Levantine Mountains to the west, or the Zagros Mountains to the east. Metal ores, particularly copper and tin necessary for bronze production, had to be imported from Anatolia, Iran, or even more distant regions. Stone for sculpture and monumental architecture was scarce in the alluvial plains and required transport from highland quarries. Luxury goods, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, carnelian from India, ivory from Syria or Africa, came to Mesopotamia through complex long-distance trade networks. Managing these networks required detailed geographic knowledge, safe routes, reliable suppliers, travel times, political conditions, and seasonal factors affecting trade. The geographic knowledge encoded in maps and itinerary texts represented crucial economic infrastructure, enabling Mesopotamian prosperity.
The relationship between map and territory in Babylonian cartography differed fundamentally from modern conceptions. Modern maps attempt to represent territory with maximum accuracy, using standardized scales and projections to enable precise navigation and measurement. Babylonian maps instead presented schematic representations, emphasizing relationships and hierarchy rather than precise geometric accuracy. Babylon was shown at the center, not because this reflected geometric reality, but because it expressed political and religious reality. Babylon was indeed the center of the civilized world in terms of political power, religious significance, and cultural influence. Similarly, the outer regions beyond the Bitter River represented not so much specific geographic locations as conceptual space, the realm of legend and mythology that lay beyond certain knowledge, the dangerous and wonderful periphery that defined the known world by contrast.
This approach to cartography reflected a more general characteristic of ancient Near Eastern thought, a focus on essential relationships and meaningful patterns rather than abstract geometric precision. When a Babylonian mathematical text describes a field as having certain dimensions, the numbers often reflect ideal proportions rather than actual measurements. When a building inscription describes a temple's construction, the account emphasizes the building's religious significance and the king's piety rather than technical construction details. Similarly, a world map presented the meaningful structure of the cosmos, the relationships between center and periphery, civilization and chaos, known and unknown, rather than attempting geometric precision. This does not reflect confusion or incapacity, but rather different priorities and purposes.
The multi-layered symbolism of the Babylonian world map becomes clearer when we compare it to other ancient cosmographic traditions. The ancient Egyptians conceived the earth as a flat plain, sometimes described as the god Geb lying prone, with the sky goddess Nut arching over him, her star-spangled body supported by the gods of the cardinal directions. The universe was surrounded by Nun, the primordial waters of chaos from which creation emerged and to which it would eventually return. Egyptian maps, when they depicted cosmic structure rather than practical geography, showed the Nile River at the center, with Egypt as the civilized land par excellence, surrounded by foreign lands of decreasing order and increasing chaos. Ancient Hebrew cosmology, reflected in biblical creation accounts, similarly described a flat earth covered by the dome of heaven, with waters above and below. Each ancient cosmographic tradition reflected its own geographic circumstances, religious beliefs, and political ideologies, creating distinctive visions of cosmic structure.
Yet certain commonalities appear across these different ancient worldviews. Most ancient cosmologies describe the Earth as flat or nearly flat, a reasonable conclusion from observable evidence and the most intuitive interpretation of horizon phenomena. Most placed their own civilization at the geographic center, reflecting both political ideology and the natural human tendency to understand the world from one's own perspective. Most included cosmic waters surrounding or underlying the Earth, reflecting both the importance of water for agricultural civilizations and its symbolic associations with chaos, danger, and the boundary between existence and non-existence. Most conceived of the cosmos as having a vertical structure with multiple levels, underworld, earth, and heaven, often with multiple sublevels within each domain. These structural similarities suggest common patterns in how pre-scientific civilizations conceptualized cosmic structure when working from similar observational evidence and agricultural urban civilization contexts. The Babylonian world map that Nabu-shuma-ishkin created on that day, around 600 BCE, was one of perhaps dozens or even hundreds produced over the centuries, though it is the earliest substantial example to survive. After its completion, drying, and firing, the tablet was deposited in the temple archive, where it served as a reference document and teaching tool. Students studying advanced geography would have examined it while memorizing the locations and characteristics of distant lands. Priests consulting omens might have referenced it when interpreting astronomical phenomena that ancient science associated with particular geographic regions. Administrative officials planning trade expeditions or military campaigns might have consulted it to understand the basic structure of the world into which they were venturing. The tablet thus served multiple functions: practical reference tool, educational device, religious diagram, and political statement of Babylonian centrality.
Centuries later, as Babylon declined in power and eventually fell to Persian conquest in 539 BCE, the temple archives where such tablets were stored gradually fell into disuse. The great libraries were not destroyed in a single catastrophic event, but rather slowly abandoned as the institutions that supported them collapsed. Tablets were left on their shelves as administrative systems broke down, priests died or fled without training successors, and eventually the buildings themselves began to deteriorate. Roofs collapsed, walls crumbled, and wind-blown sand slowly buried the remains. Clay tablets, those that had been properly fired, endured remarkably well under these conditions, essentially becoming ceramics that could survive indefinitely if protected from moisture and physical breakage. The Babylonian world map thus entered a sleep of more than 2,000 years, buried beneath the accumulated debris of civilizations that rose and fell above it, forgotten completely as knowledge of cuneiform writing itself was lost, and the very existence of ancient Mesopotamian civilization faded from human memory.
The rediscovery of ancient Mesopotamia in the 19th century represented one of archaeology's greatest triumphs. When European explorers and archaeologists first excavated the massive tells, or occupation mounds of Iraq, they uncovered not just impressive architecture, but entire archives of written documents that opened windows into civilizations that had been completely forgotten. The decipherment of cuneiform in the mid-19th century, one of the most remarkable intellectual achievements of that era, suddenly made these documents readable, revealing the political history, religious beliefs, literary traditions, and daily life of peoples who had flourished and vanished millennia ago. Each new tablet translated added to this reconstructed picture, and particularly significant discoveries like the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Code of Hammurabi, or the Babylonian world map attracted international attention, fundamentally changing modern understanding of human history and the development of civilization.
When Hormuzd-Rassam identified the small clay tablet bearing the world map in 1882, he could not possibly have recognized its full significance immediately. The tablet was damaged, its lower portion broken away, and its dense cuneiform inscription required careful study by specialists. Over the following decades, Assyriologists gradually decoded its contents, recognizing the circular diagram as a cosmographic representation and translating the accompanying text that described the world's structure and the mysterious outer regions beyond the Bitter River. This translation process was complex, for the tablet employed technical terminology and obscure mythological references that required extensive comparison with other texts to understand properly. Even today, certain aspects of the tablet's inscriptions remain unclear, and scholarly debate continues over precise interpretations of some passages.
Yet the basic structure and meaning of the Babylonian world map is clear and profoundly revealing. It shows us how a sophisticated ancient civilization with advanced mathematics, astronomy, administrative organization, and literary culture conceived of their world not as a sphere floating in space, but as a flat disk floating on cosmic waters, surrounded by mysterious outer regions where legend and reality merged. This worldview, so different from our modern understanding, yet so logical within its own framework, reminds us that human knowledge is always conditioned by cultural context, available evidence, and the conceptual tools available for interpreting that evidence. The Babylonian scribes who created these maps were not ignorant primitives, but sophisticated scholars working within a coherent intellectual tradition that successfully integrated diverse domains of knowledge into a meaningful whole. Their flat Earth model reflected not failure of observation or reasoning, but simply different starting assumptions and different evidence than would later become available to reshape human understanding of the cosmos.
The legacy of Babylonian cartography extended far beyond their own civilization. As Mesopotamian cultural influence spread through conquest, trade, and scholarly exchange, their geographic knowledge and cartographic conventions influenced neighboring peoples. Persian administrators who conquered Babylon in 539 BCE inherited Mesopotamian administrative systems and geographic knowledge. Greek scholars who traveled to the Near East encountered Babylonian astronomy and geography, which influenced their own developing geographic theories. The famous Greek geographer Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, described the world in terms that show clear influence from Near Eastern geographic traditions, though Greeks would soon develop their own distinctive theories. Even as the spherical Earth model gained acceptance among Greek philosophers and astronomers from the 4th century BCE onward, older flat Earth conceptions persisted in popular understanding for centuries, showing the enduring power of intuitive observational models.
The Babylonian world map thus stands at a crucial juncture in human intellectual history, representing the culmination of thousands of years of Mesopotamian geographic knowledge, while also marking a tradition that would soon be superseded by new theories based on different evidence and reasoning. When we examine this small clay tablet today, displayed in the British Museum among countless other artifacts of ancient Mesopotamia, we should see not a quaint or primitive curiosity, but a sophisticated intellectual achievement, representing one civilization's best understanding of cosmic structure. It reminds us that knowledge is always provisional, always shaped by cultural context and available evidence, and that future generations may regard our own confident certainties with the same combination of respect for effort and recognition of limitations that we bring to studying ancient worldviews. The Babylonian cartographers established fundamental conventions: the use of graphic representation to convey geographic knowledge, the integration of practical and symbolic information, the attempt to create comprehensive pictures of cosmic structure that continue to influence how we map and understand our world, even as the specific content of those maps has changed beyond recognition.
The Mediterranean sun rose over Alexandria in the 2nd century of the Common Era, casting golden light across the greatest city of the ancient world. Its famous harbor bustled with ships from every corner of the known world, from the distant reaches of Britannia to the spice markets of India, from the amber coasts of the Baltic to the mysterious lands beyond the Sahara. But the true treasures flowing into this Egyptian metropolis were not silks or spices, not gold or grain, but something far more valuable: knowledge itself. Alexandria stood as the undisputed intellectual capital of antiquity, home to the legendary library and museum, institutions that had attracted scholars, philosophers, and scientists for centuries. Within these hallowed halls, surrounded by hundreds of thousands of scrolls representing the accumulated wisdom of civilizations, a man named Claudius Ptolemy was about to transform humanity's understanding of the world and how to represent it. The revolution he would spark would echo through the centuries, fundamentally altering how we perceive, navigate, and conceptualize our planet. His innovation was elegant in its simplicity, yet profound in its implications. He would impose upon the curved surface of Earth an invisible grid of mathematical coordinates, transforming geography from an art of description into a science of precision.
This is the story of how one scholar, building on centuries of Greek intellectual achievement, created a framework that would define cartography for over a millennium. Ptolemy was not working in isolation. He stood at the culmination of a long tradition of Greek scientific inquiry that had gradually stripped away mythological explanations and replaced them with mathematical reasoning. The ancient Greeks had already determined that Earth was spherical, not flat as common intuition might suggest, and had even calculated its circumference with remarkable accuracy. They understood the mechanics of solar and lunar eclipses, had cataloged the stars, and had developed sophisticated mathematical tools, including geometry and trigonometry. Alexandria itself was the creation of Alexander the Great, the Macedonian conqueror who had carried Greek culture across the known world in the 4th century BCE. After Alexander's death, his general Ptolemy I Soter seized Egypt and established the Ptolemaic dynasty that would rule for 3 centuries. This earlier Ptolemy founded the library and museum, creating institutions that would outlive his dynasty and become synonymous with learning itself. By Claudius Ptolemy's time, he lived approximately from 100 to 170 CE, Alexandria had already enjoyed 4 centuries as a beacon of scholarship, attracting the brightest minds from across the Mediterranean and beyond. The Library of Alexandria was more than a repository of scrolls. It was a living institution where scholars debated, calculated, and experimented. Its holdings were encyclopedic, encompassing not just Greek works but texts from Egypt, Persia, India, and distant China, many translated into Greek by teams of dedicated scholars. Here one could find the mathematical treatises of Euclid, who had taught in Alexandria and whose elements provided the geometric foundation for all subsequent science. Here were the astronomical observations of Hipparchus, who had catalogued over 850 stars and discovered the precession of the equinoxes. Here were the geographical calculations of Eratosthenes, another Alexandrian scholar who had served as chief librarian in the 3rd century BCE and who had performed one of the most elegant experiments in scientific history. Eratosthenes had noticed that at noon on the summer solstice, the sun shone directly down a well in Syene, modern Aswan, in southern Egypt, casting no shadow. But on the same date in Alexandria, about 5,000 stadia to the north, vertical objects cast distinct shadows. By measuring the angle of this shadow, approximately 7 degrees, and applying geometric principles, Eratosthenes calculated that Earth's circumference must be approximately 250,000 stadia. While the exact length of a stadion varies in ancient sources, making precise conversion difficult, his calculation was remarkably accurate, likely within 15% of the true value. This was the intellectual heritage Ptolemy inherited, a tradition that valued empirical observation, mathematical reasoning, and systematic methodology. Ptolemy's great contribution was to synthesize this heritage and apply it systematically to the challenge of representing Earth's surface. His masterwork, which we know by its Latin title Geographia, was actually called Geographicae Hypagesis in Greek, meaning Guide to Geography. This treatise, composed around 150 CE, was revolutionary in multiple dimensions. First, Ptolemy established a clear theoretical foundation for cartography, distinguishing it from chorography, regional description, and emphasizing the importance of mathematical accuracy over artistic impression. Second, he developed the coordinate system of latitude and longitude that remains fundamental to geography today. Third, he grappled with the mathematical challenge of map projections, how to represent the curved surface of a sphere on a flat plane while minimizing distortion. Fourth, he compiled an enormous gazetteer listing the coordinates of thousands of locations across the known world. And finally, he provided instructions for constructing world maps and regional maps based on these coordinates, creating a reproducible system that later cartographers could follow and update. The concept of dividing Earth's surface into a grid of intersecting lines was not entirely new. Hipparchus had suggested something similar 2 centuries earlier, but Ptolemy systematized and popularized it. He defined latitude as the angular distance north or south of the equator, measured in degrees from 0 at the equator to 90 at the poles. This was the relatively straightforward dimension because latitude could be determined astronomically by measuring the altitude of the sun at noon or the angle of Polaris, the North Star, above the horizon. These measurements varied predictably as one traveled north or south, and ancient scholars had long recognized that different locations experienced different day lengths at different seasons depending on their north-south position. Longitude, however, presented a much greater challenge. Ptolemy defined it as the angular distance east or west from a prime meridian, which he placed at the Fortunate Islands, likely the Canary Islands, at the western edge of the known world. Unlike latitude, longitude could not be easily determined through astronomical observation with ancient technology. The method required comparing local time with a reference time,
which in turn required accurate timekeeping devices that would not exist for another 15 centuries. Ptolemy and his predecessors had to estimate longitude primarily by calculating distances traveled, a notoriously unreliable method subject to cumulative errors. To gather the information needed for his coordinate listings, Ptolemy drew on every available source. Ancient Alexandria was uniquely positioned for this task because it sat at the crossroads of global trade networks. Ships from across the Mediterranean docked in its harbor. Caravans arrived from the interior of Africa. Trade routes stretched east to India and beyond, carrying not just goods but information. Roman military campaigns had mapped much of Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East with systematic precision. Ptolemy consulted written itineraries, lists of places and distances along traveled routes. He examined merchant accounts and travelers' tales, always attempting to extract quantifiable data from narrative descriptions. He utilized astronomical observations when available, as these could provide accurate latitude measurements. He built upon the work of Marinus of Tyre, an earlier geographer whose now lost writings Ptolemy frequently cited and critiqued. The process was painstaking and imperfect. Many sources contradicted each other. Distance estimates were often wildly inaccurate, inflated by difficult terrain or deflated by optimistic merchants. Longitude calculations, dependent on these unreliable distances, accumulated errors that distorted the east-west dimensions of Ptolemy's world. Yet despite these limitations, Ptolemy's systematic approach represented an enormous leap forward in geographic knowledge.
The world that emerged from Ptolemy's calculations stretched from the Atlantic Ocean in the west to China in the east, and from the frozen lands of Scandinavia in the north to the sources of the Nile in the south. It was a world centered on the Mediterranean, which the Romans called Mare Nostrum, our sea. The Mediterranean appears in Ptolemy's maps as a relatively accurate body of water, its coastlines and islands recognizable to modern eyes, though with distortions and errors. Italy's boot shape is discernible, though the peninsula tilts too much to the east. Greece and the Aegean are reasonably well represented, benefiting from centuries of Greek maritime exploration. The Iberian Peninsula is there, though its east-west extent is exaggerated. The outline of Africa's northern coast is recognizable, at least as far as the Gulf of Sidra in Libya, though it too stretches farther east than reality. Britain appears as an island, though tilted clockwise from its true orientation, making Scotland point more east than north. Ireland is present, but misshapen. Scandinavia appears as a peninsula, though its northward extension is underestimated. The Rhine and Danube rivers, crucial boundaries of the Roman Empire, are mapped with reasonable accuracy. The Black Sea and Caspian Sea appear, though both are distorted in size and shape. As Ptolemy's maps extend beyond the well-traveled regions of the Roman Empire, distortions become more pronounced. Asia stretches far too wide in the east-west direction, a fundamental error that would have profound historical consequences. Ptolemy placed China in the eastern edge of the known world at approximately 180 degrees of longitude from his prime meridian, suggesting that the Eurasian landmass covered half the globe's circumference. In reality, the distance from the Canary Islands to China covers only about 130 degrees of longitude, meaning Ptolemy's Asia is extended by approximately 50 degrees, or roughly 3,500 miles too far east. This error resulted partly from underestimating Earth's total circumference. Ptolemy rejected Eratosthenes' more accurate calculation and accepted a smaller estimate by Posidonius, and partly from cumulative errors in distance measurements along the Silk Road and maritime trade routes to India. The practical consequence of this error would not become apparent for over a millennium, when Christopher Columbus, consulting maps based on Ptolemy's geography, would drastically underestimate the westward distance to Asia. Columbus believed he could reach the Indies by sailing west from Spain, because Ptolemaic geography made Asia extend so far east that the gap across the Atlantic appeared manageable. Of course, an unknown double continent, the Americans, occupied that supposedly narrow gap, though Columbus died believing he had reached the Asian coast. Ptolemy's depiction of the Indian Ocean constituted another major error, with both geographic and conceptual implications. In his maps, this ocean appears not as an open body of water, but as an enclosed sea, surrounded by land that curves around from eastern Africa to eastern Asia, creating a vast southern continent that he called terra incognita, unknown land. This enclosed ocean theory contradicted earlier Greek geographers like Eratosthenes and Strabo, who had suggested that the Indian Ocean connected with other oceanic waters. Why did Ptolemy make this choice? The evidence is unclear, but it may have resulted from misinterpreting accounts of Southeast Asian geography, or from theoretical assumptions about global land-to-water ratios, or perhaps from limited information about voyages that had actually circumnavigated the Indian Ocean. Regardless of the reason, this error would be perpetuated through medieval and Renaissance cartography until Portuguese explorers in the late 15th century definitively proved that Africa could be circumnavigated, that the Indian Ocean connected with the Atlantic, and that no vast southern continent blocked maritime passage. The persistence of this error demonstrates both the authority that Ptolemy's work commanded and the difficulty of correcting geographic mistakes in an age when few individuals could verify distant geography through personal experience.
The technical challenge that most absorbed Ptolemy's mathematical genius was map projection. the problem of representing a spherical surface on a flat plane. This is an inherently impossible task in the sense that no projection can perfectly preserve all properties simultaneously. A sphere's surface cannot be flattened without some form of distortion. Distances, directions, angles, and areas cannot all be maintained accurately at once. The cartographer must choose which properties to prioritize and which distortions to accept. Early maps had often ignored this problem entirely, presenting a crude, flat view of the world with no mathematical basis. Ptolemy, however, approached map projection as a mathematical problem, requiring systematic solutions. In the Geographia, he presented 3 different projection methods, each representing a different compromise between accuracy and practicality. His first projection, the simplest, used straight lines for meridians, lines of longitude, with evenly spaced parallels, lines of latitude, in a simple conic arrangement. This had the advantage of being easy to draw and calculate, but produced increasing distortion at higher latitudes. His second projection, more sophisticated, curved the meridians to better approximate their actual convergence toward the poles and adjusted the spacing of parallels to maintain better proportionality. This required more complex mathematics but produced a more accurate representation. His third projection, the most complex, attempted to create a perspective view, as if viewing the globe from a distance, curving both meridians and parallels in a way that suggested three-dimensionality. Each of these projections represented a sophisticated understanding of the mathematical relationship between spherical and planar geometry. The heart of Ptolemy's Geographia was its gazetteer, an extensive list of coordinates for locations across the known world. This catalog included approximately 8,000 places, from major cities to small towns, from mountain peaks to river mouths, from tribal territories to provincial boundaries. Each entry provided a name and 2 numbers, latitude and longitude, in degrees and fractions of degrees. This was revolutionary. For the first time, locations were defined not by verbal descriptions or relative positions, but by absolute mathematical coordinates. Alexandria was not just on the Egyptian coast at the mouth of the Nile, but precisely at 31 degrees north latitude and 60 degrees 30 minutes east longitude, measured from Ptolemy's prime meridian. Rome was 41 degrees 50 minutes north and 36 degrees 40 minutes east. Londinium, London, was 54 degrees north and 20 degrees east. These coordinates were often significantly wrong by modern measurements. Ptolemy's London is both too far north and too far east, but the principle was sound. A coordinate system provided an objective framework that different cartographers could share. If 2 scholars disagreed about the relative positions of cities, they could compare coordinates and attempt to resolve a discrepancy through new observations or recalculations. The gazetteer transformed geography from a literary discipline into a data science, where information could be systematically collected, recorded, compared, and updated. Working in the Museum of Alexandria, Ptolemy would have had access to astronomical instruments that enabled relatively precise measurements. The gnomon, a simple vertical stick or pillar, could measure the sun's shadow at noon to determine latitude. The armillary sphere, a complex arrangement of rotating rings representing celestial circles, could model the heavens and predict astronomical phenomena. The astrolabe, a sophisticated instrument perfected in the Hellenistic world, could measure the altitude of celestial objects and solve various astronomical problems. The dioptra, a precision sighting instrument, could measure angles for surveying and astronomical observation. With these tools, Ptolemy could refine latitude measurements for locations with astronomical observations, though the majority of his coordinates necessarily depended on calculated distances rather than direct observation. We can imagine him in the museum's observatory, tracking the sun's path across the sky, measuring star altitudes at night, consulting tables of astronomical data compiled by predecessors like Hipparchus, and meticulously recording his observations on papyrus scrolls. The work required patience, mathematical skill, and careful attention to detail, precisely the qualities that Ptolemy demonstrated throughout his scientific career.
Ptolemy's intellectual output extended far beyond geography. He was a polymath whose works influenced multiple scientific disciplines for centuries. His astronomical treatise, known by its Arabic name Almagest, meaning the greatest, presented a comprehensive mathematical model of the cosmos based on the geocentric assumption that Earth stood stationary at the universe's center, while sun, moon, planets, and stars revolved around it in complex circular motions. While this model was ultimately incorrect, Copernicus would demonstrate in the 16th century that the sun, not Earth, occupies the solar system's center. Ptolemy's mathematical framework was sophisticated enough to predict celestial phenomena with impressive accuracy. The Almagest remained the standard astronomical text for over a millennium. Ptolemy also wrote on optics, studying reflection and refraction of light, on harmonics, exploring mathematical relationships in music, on astrology, which he considered a legitimate predictive science based on celestial influences, and on philosophy, defending the role of mathematical sciences in understanding the cosmos.
This breadth reflects the integrated nature of ancient science, where astronomy, mathematics, geography, and philosophy were interconnected disciplines exploring different aspects of cosmic order. The fate of Ptolemy's Geographia illustrates the fragile nature of intellectual transmission across historical upheavals. After the collapse of the Roman Empire in the West during the 5th century CE, knowledge of Greek declined dramatically in Western Europe. The works of ancient scholars were lost, forgotten, or survived only in fragmentary form. The Library of Alexandria itself had declined over centuries and was largely destroyed through various calamities by the time of the Arab conquest of Egypt in the 7th century. In Western Europe, Ptolemy's Geographia disappeared from view during the medieval period, known only through brief references in other texts. The sophisticated maps and coordinate system vanished, replaced by medieval cartographic traditions that prioritized theological symbolism over mathematical accuracy. The famous TO maps of the Middle Ages showed the world as a circle divided into 3 continents, Asia, Europe, and Africa, arranged around a T-shaped Mediterranean and Nile, with Jerusalem at the center and East at the top. These maps served religious and pedagogical purposes, but abandoned Ptolemy's scientific framework entirely. However, Ptolemy's work was not truly lost. It was preserved, studied, and enhanced by Islamic scholars. The Islamic Golden Age, spanning roughly from the 8th to the 14th century, saw Arabic-speaking scholars across the Middle East, North Africa, and Spain enthusiastically embrace Greek scientific texts, translating them into Arabic and building upon their foundations. The Almagest was translated in the 9th century and became foundational to Islamic astronomy. The Geographia was translated as well, though somewhat later. Islamic geographers like Al-Khwarizmi, Al-Biruni, and Al-Idrisi studied Ptolemy's coordinates, corrected some of his errors based on new observations and measurements, and extended geographic knowledge to regions Ptolemy had never known. Al-Idrisi, working in 12th century Sicily, created a world map incorporating Islamic geographic knowledge with Ptolemaic principles. Islamic mathematicians developed trigonometry far beyond Greek levels, providing better tools for astronomical and geographic calculations. Arabic numerals, originally from India, revolutionized mathematical notation. Islamic navigators explored the Indian Ocean and beyond, gathering geographic information that would eventually flow back into European cartography. In this way, the Islamic world served as both preserver and enhancer of ancient geographic knowledge, maintaining the flame of systematic geography while Western Europe struggled through its medieval period.
The rediscovery of Ptolemy's Geographia in Western Europe during the Renaissance represented a pivotal moment in intellectual history. In 1406, a manuscript of the Geographia in Greek was brought from Constantinople to Florence by the Byzantine scholar Manuel Chrysoloras, who was teaching Greek in Italy. Jacopo d'Angelo translated the text into Latin, making it accessible to European scholars who could not read Greek. The impact was immediate and profound. Here was a systematic mathematical approach to geography, complete with coordinates, map projections, and instructions for map-making, vastly more sophisticated than anything available in medieval European cartography. Renaissance scholars were electrified. The Geographia aligned perfectly with the broader Renaissance project of recovering and reviving classical learning. It offered a geographic framework at precisely the moment when European exploration was beginning to expand beyond traditional Mediterranean boundaries. The invention of printing shortly afterward, around 1450, enabled rapid dissemination of Ptolemy's work. The first printed edition appeared in 1475, and numerous editions followed, many including maps based on Ptolemy's coordinates. These maps became foundational documents for the age of exploration. Cartographers studied them, argued over them, and attempted to reconcile Ptolemaic coordinates with new discoveries. Explorers consulted them when planning voyages. Universities taught Ptolemaic geography as scientific orthodoxy. Yet this revival created a paradox. European explorers of the 15th and 16th centuries were simultaneously utilizing and refuting Ptolemy's geography. When Portuguese navigators began systematically exploring Africa's western coast in the early 1400s, they quickly discovered that Africa extended much farther south than Ptolemy's maps indicated. When Bartholomew Diaz rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1488 and Vasco da Gama reached India by sailing around Africa in 1498, they definitively disproved Ptolemy's enclosed Indian Ocean. When Columbus crossed the Atlantic in 1492, he was partly motivated by Ptolemaic errors that made Asia appear closer than reality, though he stumbled upon an entire hemisphere unknown to Ptolemy. When Ferdinand Magellan's expedition circumnavigated the globe from 1519 to 1522, it revealed an Earth much larger than Ptolemy had calculated and an oceanic world far more extensive than ancient geographers had imagined. Each voyage revealed errors in Ptolemaic geography, yet each also demonstrated the value of systematic, coordinate-based cartography that Ptolemy had pioneered. The solution was not to discard Ptolemy's framework, but to correct his data, replacing ancient coordinates with new measurements, filling blank spaces with new discoveries, and gradually constructing an accurate world map using Ptolemaic principles of latitude, longitude, and mathematical projection.
The philosophical revolution implicit in Ptolemy's work is as significant as its technical innovations. Ancient worldviews had often been mythological, understanding Earth in terms of sacred geography, where divine forces shaped the landscape and supernatural beings inhabited various regions. The Babylonians placed their city at the cosmic center, surrounded by mystical waters. The Greeks populated their maps with gods, heroes, and monsters. The biblical tradition placed Jerusalem at Earth's center and organized geography around sacred history. Ptolemy's approach represented a fundamentally different worldview, the world as a mathematical object governed by measurable relationships accessible to human reason and representable through geometric abstraction. This was a world where Alexandria and Rome were not spiritually or mythologically superior to other locations, but simply occupied different positions on a coordinate grid. This was a world where the distance between cities was not a matter of heroic journeys and divine intervention, but of degrees of latitude and longitude that could be calculated and verified. This secular mathematical worldview did not necessarily deny religious or mythological truths. Ptolemy himself wrote astrological texts that assumed cosmic influences on human affairs, but it established a parallel framework where empirical observation and rational calculation took precedence over revelation and tradition.
This shift from subjective to objective representation marked the birth of cartography as a scientific discipline. Earlier maps had been subjective in multiple senses. They reflected the mapmaker's limited personal knowledge, they emphasized places of importance to the mapmaker's culture, and they often served ideological purposes by glorifying empires or illustrating religious teachings. Ptolemy's coordinate system offered objectivity. Any location had coordinates independent of who was observing or why. Of course, this objectivity was theoretical rather than absolute. Ptolemy's own coordinates reflected the limitations and biases of his sources, and even today's satellite-based positioning systems involve human choices about reference frames and measurement conventions. But the aspiration toward objectivity, toward representing the world as it is rather than as we wish it to be, became central to the scientific project. This same aspiration would later drive natural scientists to measure, quantify, and mathematize their observations of nature, ultimately leading to the scientific revolution of the 17th century. In this sense, Ptolemy's geographic grid was part of a broader intellectual movement toward understanding the world through mathematics, a movement that would eventually produce modern science and technology. Ptolemy's legacy is complex and multifaceted. His coordinate system, refined and corrected over centuries, remains fundamental to geography. Every GPS device, every online map, every geographic information system employs coordinates descended from Ptolemy's innovation. His recognition that cartography must grapple with map projections remains central to the discipline. Modern cartographers still choose among dozens of projection systems, depending on their specific needs, just as Ptolemy chose among his 3 projections. His systematic approach to collecting and organizing geographic information anticipated modern databases and geographic information science. Yet his specific maps, with their errors and limitations, were superseded centuries ago. His geocentric astronomy was overturned by Copernican heliocentrism. His mathematical techniques, sophisticated for his time, are elementary by modern standards. This combination, fundamental insights that remain valid, specific claims that have been refuted, is typical of major scientific works. Newton's physics provided an accurate framework for understanding motion and gravity, while containing errors about absolute space and time that Einstein's relativity corrected. Darwin's evolutionary theory identified natural selection as the primary mechanism of evolution, while getting many genetic details wrong before DNA was understood. Similarly, Ptolemy established the framework for scientific cartography, while making numerous errors about specific geographic facts. This is how science progresses, not by waiting for perfect knowledge before acting, but by establishing theoretical frameworks that guide observation and can be corrected as new information becomes available. The human dimension of Ptolemy's work is worth considering. We know remarkably little about Ptolemy as a person. He tells us almost nothing about himself in his writings, following the conventions of ancient scientific texts that emphasized results rather than personal narratives. We do not know where he was born, who his teachers were, or what he looked like. We do not know whether he traveled widely or remained in Alexandria. We do not know how he supported himself, though he was likely affiliated with the museum or enjoyed private patronage. We do not know whether he had family, friends, or students. What we do know is that he spent years, perhaps decades, engaged in the painstaking work of calculation and compilation that produced his geographic treatise. We can imagine him at his desk, surrounded by scrolls, consulting reports from merchants and military campaigns, calculating distances and angles, drawing his grid lines and plotting coordinates, checking and rechecking his mathematics. This was work requiring immense patience and dedication,
carried out without computers, calculators, or even Arabic numerals. Every calculation was performed by hand using Greek alphabetic numerals or geometrical methods. Every map was drawn manually, requiring both mathematical precision and artistic skill. The magnitude of this achievement becomes more impressive when we consider the limitations of ancient technology and the sheer volume of data Ptolemy processed.
The broader context of 2nd century Alexandria helps us understand Ptolemy's work. This was the height of the Pax Romana, the Roman peace that had brought relative stability and prosperity to the Mediterranean world for over a century. The Roman Empire stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia, from the Rhine to the Sahara, encompassing perhaps 60 million people, speaking dozens of languages, but connected by Roman roads, Mediterranean shipping, common coinage, and shared governance. Alexandria was the empire's second city, surpassed only by Rome itself, and in intellectual matters it remained preeminent. It was a cosmopolitan center where Greeks, Egyptians, Jews, Romans, and visitors from across the known world mingled and exchanged ideas. The city's famous lighthouse, the Pharos, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, guided ships into its harbor. Its museum and library, though past their peak, still functioned as research and teaching institutions. The city was wealthy from Egyptian grain exports and from serving as an entrepot for luxury goods from the East, silk from China, spices from India, incense from Arabia. This prosperity supported a leisure class who could pursue scholarship without worrying about subsistence. Roman military campaigns had pushed the frontiers of geographic knowledge, mapping Britain, subduing Dacia, Romania, and campaigning in Mesopotamia. Roman trade reached far beyond imperial boundaries, with merchants traveling the Silk Road to China and maritime traders sailing monsoon winds to India and beyond. All this information flowed through Alexandria, providing Ptolemy with the raw material for his geographic synthesis. Yet even as Ptolemy worked, the forces that would eventually destroy this intellectual world were gathering. The 2nd century CE represented the Roman Empire's zenith. The 3rd century would bring crisis, division, and transformation. The Antonine Plague, likely smallpox, ravaged the empire in Ptolemy's lifetime, killing millions. Political instability would soon follow, with rapid turnover of emperors and destructive civil wars. The economy would suffer from inflation, taxation, and disruption of trade. Christianity, still a minority religion in Ptolemy's time, would grow rapidly and eventually become the empire's official religion, bringing new intellectual priorities and sometimes hostile attitudes toward pagan learning. The Western Roman Empire would collapse entirely by 476 CE, fragmenting into Germanic kingdoms. The Eastern Roman Empire, later called Byzantine, would survive another 1,000 years, but would lose Egypt to Islamic conquest in the 7th century. The intellectual tradition that had flourished in Alexandria for over 6 centuries would be disrupted, dispersed, and transformed. The library's final destruction remains debated among historians. There was no single dramatic burning, but rather a gradual decline over centuries, but by the time of the Arab conquest, little remained of its legendary collections. Ptolemy could not have foreseen these developments, but he was working at the end of an era, compiling and systematizing knowledge that would soon be scattered and forgotten in the lands of its origin. This historical contingency, the possibility that knowledge can be lost as well as gained, makes the preservation and transmission of Ptolemy's work through Islamic civilization particularly crucial. If Islamic scholars had not translated, studied, and preserved Ptolemy's writings, they might have disappeared entirely, like the vast majority of ancient texts. We know that the Library of Alexandria once contained hundreds of thousands of scrolls, representing the accumulated knowledge of multiple civilizations. Only a tiny fraction survived, and most of what survived did so because it was preserved in multiple copies across different regions. The Geographia survived because Byzantine scholars maintained copies, because Islamic translators deemed it worth preserving, and because Renaissance humanists recognized its value. This chain of transmission across cultures and centuries was fragile. Many other ancient works were not so fortunate. The history of knowledge is not a simple story of continuous progress, but a complex narrative of creation, loss, preservation, and rediscovery, where contingent human choices determine what survives and what disappears. Ptolemy's work also raises questions about the relationship between theoretical frameworks and empirical data. His coordinate system and map projections represented a theoretical framework, a mathematical structure for organizing geographic information. His specific coordinates represented empirical data, measurements and estimates of actual locations. The framework proved more durable than the data because frameworks, if well designed, can accommodate corrections and improvements while maintaining their basic structure. When explorers discovered errors in Ptolemy's coordinates, they did not abandon coordinates altogether. They calculated better coordinates using the same framework. When Ptolemy's Earth circumference proved too small, cartographers did not reject the concept of measuring Earth's size. They recalculated using better data. This pattern appears throughout science. Theoretical frameworks persist and evolve, while specific measurements and models are frequently updated or replaced. Einstein did not discard Newton's framework of mathematical physics, he generalized it. Modern evolutionary biologists have extensively revised Darwin's specific mechanisms while maintaining his theoretical framework of descent with modification through natural selection. Similarly, modern cartographers have infinitely more accurate geographic data than Ptolemy, but still use his fundamental innovation of imposing a mathematical coordinate grid on Earth's surface. The emotional and intellectual experience of engaging with Ptolemy's work, whether as a Renaissance scholar encountering it for the first time, or as a modern student studying the history of cartography, involves a distinctive mixture of admiration and recognition of limitations. There is genuine awe at the sophistication of his mathematical approach, at the ambition of mapping the entire known world, at the systematic organization of thousands of coordinates. Seeing Ptolemy's maps, even knowing they contain significant errors, one cannot help but admire the achievement they represent. At the same time, identifying the errors and understanding their sources, the technological limitations, the unreliable sources, the accumulated mistakes, reminds us that all knowledge is provisional and contingent. The maps that seemed comprehensive to Renaissance scholars appear incomplete to us. The measurements that seemed precise to ancient astronomers seem crude by modern standards. This should instill intellectual humility. What we consider comprehensive and precise today will likely appear incomplete and crude to future generations. Scientific knowledge grows not through sudden revelations of absolute truth, but through gradual refinement of provisional understanding, each generation building on and correcting the work of predecessors. In the quiet halls of the Library of Alexandria, working by lamplight among the scrolls, Ptolemy could not have imagined the full consequences of his innovation. He could not have known that his coordinate system would still be in use 2 millennia later. He could not have foreseen the age of exploration, when European navigators would consult his maps while simultaneously discovering their errors. He could not have anticipated GPS satellites, computer mapping, or geographic information systems. He could not have imagined that his name would be remembered and honored long after the empires he knew, Roman, Ptolemaic, Persian, had crumbled into dust. He was simply doing what scholars do, trying to make sense of the available information, imposing order on complexity, developing systematic methods for understanding the world. That his methods proved so durable, that his theoretical framework survived even when his specific data was corrected, testifies to the power of mathematical abstraction and systematic thinking. The grid of knowledge that Ptolemy imposed on the world was invisible. No one would ever see latitude and longitude lines except on maps. But it was real in the sense that it accurately reflected spatial relationships and enabled more precise navigation, communication, and understanding. This is the peculiar power of scientific abstraction, to create invisible structures that help us comprehend and navigate reality more effectively than relying on unaided perception alone.
The winter light filtering through the narrow windows of Hereford Cathedral scriptorium cast long shadows across the largest vellum surface ever assembled for a single artistic purpose. It was approximately 1300 CE, and a project of extraordinary ambition was nearing completion. Brother Richard, whose name would be inscribed in the map's corner, stepped back from his work, brush trembling slightly in his aged hand. Before him lay not merely a map in any sense we would recognize today, but a complete theological cosmology, rendered in ink, gold leaf, and reverent imagination, a vision of the entire world as understood through the lens of medieval Christian faith. The Hereford Mappa Mundi, as it would come to be known, measured approximately 5 feet in diameter, drawn on a single enormous sheet of vellum made from the skin of an entire calf. But to describe it simply as a map would be to fundamentally misunderstand its purpose, its meaning, and the worldview it so perfectly encapsulated. This was not a tool for navigation, not a practical guide for merchants or sailors seeking to find their way from port to port. Instead, it was a spiritual diagram, a moral geography, a visualization of salvation history itself compressed into circular form and displayed for the edification of the faithful who would gaze upon it in wonder and devotion.
Brother Richard had devoted years to this work, following traditions established by generations of monk cartographers before him. He understood that his task was not to accurately represent coastlines, calculate distances, or facilitate commerce. Such concerns belonged to the secular world of merchants and mariners who possessed their own practical knowledge of geography, knowledge that was oral, experiential, and unrecorded in the great works of theological cartography. No, Brother Richard's mission was far more profound, to reveal divine order, to show how all of creation fit into God's plan, to demonstrate visually what Scripture taught narratively, that the world itself was a stage for the drama of salvation, with every location possessing spiritual significance beyond its mere physical existence. To understand the Mappa Mundi, we must first abandon our modern expectations of what a map should be. We must set aside our assumptions about accuracy, scale, and practical utility. We must enter into a medieval mindset where the most important truth about any location was not its longitude and latitude, but its role in biblical history, its relation to Jerusalem, its significance in the story of humanity's fall and redemption. The map makers of medieval Europe were not ignorant of geography. They were interested in a different kind of geography, a sacred geography, where theological truth took precedence over physical measurement. The structure of the Mappa Mundi followed what scholars call the TO format, a design template that had dominated European cartography for centuries. The O represented the circular boundary of the world, the ocean that surrounded all landmasses in a perfect ring. Within this circle, a T divided the known world into 3 continents, Asia occupying the entire upper half of the map, with Europe in the lower left quadrant and Africa in the lower right. The horizontal bar of the T represented the Mediterranean Sea, while the vertical stroke combined the Nile River flowing northward and the Don River flowing southward, meeting at a central point. And at that central point, where the 3 continents converged, where the waters met, at the absolute geometric center of the map, and therefore the theological center of the world, stood Jerusalem. The Holy City appeared not as a mere dot or label, but as an elaborate illustration showing the circular walls, the gates, and most prominently the site of Christ's crucifixion. This placement was not cartographically accurate. Jerusalem does not lie at the geometric center of the Eurasian African landmass, but it was theologically essential. Jerusalem was the heart of Christian salvation history, the place where the most important event in all of creation had occurred, the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Therefore, in any true map of spiritual reality, Jerusalem must occupy the center, with all other locations radiating outward from this sacred focal point. The orientation of the map struck modern viewers as equally strange. Where we automatically expect north to appear at the top of the map, the Mappa Mundi placed east, the orient from which we derive our word orientation, at the summit. This too reflected theological rather than practical considerations. East was the direction of paradise, the location of the Garden of Eden from which humanity had been expelled. At the very top of the Hereford map, Brother Richard had carefully illustrated the garden, that's 4 rivers flowing outward, the Tigris, Euphrates, Gihon, and Pishon, the latter 2 no longer identifiable in the post-fall world, but faithfully recorded from Genesis. The garden appeared as a circular island, often shown surrounded by flames or walls to indicate its inaccessibility to fallen humanity. Within the garden, Adam and Eve stood beside the tree of knowledge, the serpent coiled around its trunk, the moment of the fall forever frozen in illustrative form. This was history and geography made simultaneous. Time and space collapsed into unified meaning. The Garden of Eden was not simply somewhere in the east, but occupied a specific location on the map, as real as London or Rome, though unreachable by any earthly journey. It represented both a historical past and an eschatological future, paradise lost and the heaven yet to be regained. As Brother Richard's brush had moved across the vellum during the years of the map's creation, he had populated the world with a bewildering amalgam of locations, creations, creeples, and events drawn from multiple sources: mythical narrative, classical mythology, natural history treatises, travels accounts, and pure imaginative tradition. The result was a vision of the world that made no distinction between the historical and the legendary, the observed and the fabulous, the contemporary and the ancient. All coexisted in the eternal present of the map's theological vision. In the eastern regions of Asia, beyond the inhabitable lands but before the Garden of Eden, Brother Richard had illustrated the location where Alexander the Great had imprisoned the monstrous races of Kok and Mog behind passive gates. According to the able tradition, George F. Unlakable prophecy of classical legend, his Sears fuels free from Hunan to time to ravish the air before the final shimmed. Savage show is directed their senses, species, keep your feelings and see
interesting nature of the abstract, which draws the valve to cause the decipher and foster profitable heritage care purpose. With the advent of sacred sensory as a feature of the tongue to floy drawback stuff, with P to dork office but happily end up lovers of freedom brought to see by everyone extract surprise steel heart. As the denticate graph artifact offers, choose Hereford pure ink paid, ask your client, upload it. How its fashion were needed to process as a salad exhaustic. Seed your words with a link of slings irk. It's lie, enjoy 70 up. His advice that tests crime every time for any student ultra. Make sure I take best, mingle just mistake, ask decide vis set, hate subcycle 40 set, and here's a tower settings for 07 3 C order, logic other submuted volage. 2 F-link godston quadrant, yelling having nodes having intention, and demophis cal control fac. The cleave mean crime of archers, no one and host fista at cross modelty the croshagot. The exposure meet it, PM 668/OY5 draw and picture over vassal dimmed. A reason to keep his sat as other finding, trues out of socks, into board enveloped from application versus seafold. Checks your quadras of toast hostile, it's to troll to data caution, and satch agents, sure set touch. Or seafold to voice heresies, into which for the mormons must days have a for fifth, half to the place for
Juppe Hanksville foto Torina track and exalt sense and legro will Delis mood, with solemn Davos, Vike at Lunkerhots Pristo 50 to 65 attribute grips that tunly cover years reflective the southern shrine to Hustlet B6 Dapy setter. Davon set aside the carry for 4 synthetic heel, for the 20 was grab hilt. PF set aside the scope defects podio turn bid cave, Coslo jokes, socket to shoulder pan, carpe aminer, ho pose, H cookie, knocker maker,
But as the map extended southward into the African interior, it increasingly depicted a landscape of theological imagination rather than geographical knowledge. The Mountains of the Moon appeared as the source of the Nile, drawn from Ptolemaic geography. Creatures grew more fantastic, giant snakes, scorpions of impossible size, and various monstrous races. The southern reaches of Africa extended toward the map's circular boundary, where some medieval geographers speculated about Antipodean lands, a theologically controversial concept since it suggested regions unreachable by Christian missionaries and therefore outside the possibility of salvation. The edges of the map, where the circular world met the encompassing ocean, presented scenes of ultimate significance. Here, at the margins of the geographical world, Brother Richard had placed depictions of the Last Judgment. Christ appeared in majesty, separating the saved from the damned, the sheep from the goats, those destined for heaven from those condemned to hell. The map's spatial geography merged with temporal eschatology. The edges of the world were simultaneously the edge of time, the point where history would end and eternity begin. This placement of the Last Judgment at the map's periphery reflected a sophisticated understanding of salvation geography. The journey from the world's center in Jerusalem outward toward the edges represented the pilgrimage of the soul from sin towards judgment. Conversely, the movement from the edges towards Jerusalem represented the conversion journey of pagans and distant peoples towards Christian salvation. The map thus functioned as a diagram of spiritual movement, showing paths of both damnation and redemption inscribed in the very structure of physical space. Pilgrimage routes received special attention on the Mappa Mundi, marked more prominently than many geographic features. The roads to Jerusalem from various European starting points appeared as bold lines crossing continents, indicating stops at important shrines and holy sites along the way. Constantinople, the great Christian city of the East, appeared as a waypoint for pilgrims traveling over land. The route through Italy to ports where ships could be taken to the Holy Land was clearly marked. These were not abstract lines, but pathways that thousands of actual pilgrims had followed, would follow, roads of devotion that transformed ordinary travel into sacred journey. Santiago de Compostela in Spain, site of St. James' Shrine, appeared with special prominence, reflecting its status as one of Christianity's great pilgrimage destinations. Rome itself, Caput Mundi of both ancient empire and papal authority, appeared not at the map's center, but in its theologically appropriate position within Europe, its circular walls enclosing illustrations of major basilicas and monuments. Each pilgrimage site on the map served as a node in a network of sacred movement, transforming Europe into a landscape of devotional possibility.
Biblical events dotted the landscape, appearing in the geographical locations where they had occurred, collapsing historical time into cartographic space. The Tower of Babel appeared in Mesopotamia, a tall illustration with its builder still working at its impossible construction. Noah's Ark rested on Mount Arad, the vessel clearly visible atop the peak. The cities of Sodom and Gomorrah smoldered under divine fire in the vicinity of the Dead Sea. The Red Sea showed the parted waters with Pharaoh's army drowning while the Israelites crossed to safety. The map was not merely depicting places, but narrating stories, showing the viewer not just where events happened, but the events themselves frozen in perpetual occurrence. This narrative quality gave the Mappa Mundi its power as an educational and devotional tool. A medieval Christian studying the map would be simultaneously learning geography, reviewing biblical history, understanding salvation theology, and encountering more of lessons through the symbolic significance of creatures and peoples. It was encyclopedia, scripture, and sermon rendered in visual form, designed to be displayed prominently in the cathedral where the faithful could spend hours examining its details, each discovery leading to deeper understanding of divine truth. The map's creation required resources that only institutions of considerable wealth could muster. The vellum alone represented a substantial investment. A single sheepskin or calfskin produced a relatively small piece of parchment, so a map of the Hereford Mappa Mundi size required the largest possible hide, carefully prepared through laborious process of cleaning, stretching, scraping, and treating to produce a surface suitable for detailed illustration. The inks and pigments represented expensive materials: carbon black from soot, red from cinnabar or red lead, blue from precious lapis lazuli or less expensive azurite, green from verdigris, and gold leaf for the most important illustrations and text. Brother Richard and any assistants who worked with him belonged to an elite class of monk artists, trained in manuscript illumination, possessing skills in calligraphy, illustration, and decorative design developed over years of practice on smaller projects. The creation of such a map would have taken months or even years of painstaking work, executed in the limited daylight hours of the scriptorium or by expensive candlelight. Every line had to be drawn with careful precision, every letter of the hundreds of place names and labels inscribed in clear script, each illustration composed and executed with artistic skill. Yet for all this investment of resources and labor, the map was never intended for practical use by travelers. It remained a stationary object, likely displayed on a wall of Hereford Cathedral, where pilgrims, local residents, and visiting clergy could view it. Its function was contemplative and educational rather than navigational. To stand before the Mappa Mundi was to see the entire world, past, present, and future, laid out in comprehensive vision, to understand one's place in the cosmic drama of salvation, to grasp the theological structure underlying physical reality. Other examples of Mappa Mundi from medieval Europe reinforced and elaborated these themes. The Ebsdorf map, created around the same time in a German monastery, was even larger than the Hereford example, measuring approximately 12 feet in diameter. Most strikingly, it incorporated Christ's body into the circular world. His head appeared at the top of the map in the east, where paradise lay. His hands extended from the sides of north and south, and his feet emerged at the bottom in the west. The map was not merely a representation of Christ's world, but of Christ's body itself. The earth was the Corpus Christi, literally incorporated into divine flesh. Every location on earth existed within Christ's physical form, a powerful statement of incarnation mythology expressed through cartographic art. Tragically, the Ebsdorf map was destroyed during World War II, surviving only in photographs and reproductions. The Polster map, a much smaller example that could fit in a book, demonstrated how the TO structure and theological principles could be compressed into remarkably compact form. Despite its small size, it included the essential elements: Jerusalem at the center, paradise in the east, the three convents properly divided, and key biblical and geological locations marked. Its efficiency proved the flexibility of the Mappa Mundi tradition, adapted to various scales and contexts, qualitative, core theological cartographic vision. Some scholars have interpreted medieval Mappa Mundi as evidence of intellectual repression from classical almost. Ptolemy's geography, created in the 2nd century CE, included a closely system of units of currency, like coastal rights, and partitions, that could trace developing events were crude and accurate symbolically every life. This interpretation, however, misunderstands the length of Mappa intentions. It would have been taking and failing to create an accurate copy of representation. They would likely support new physical geography, theological theory, non-sufficient accuracy after cartography, precision.
This was particularly important in an era when Christian Europe felt itself under threat. The Islamic caliphates controlled much of the Mediterranean world, including Jerusalem itself for most of the medieval period. The Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Christian realm, was gradually losing territory to Muslim expansion. The Crusades represented attempts to reverse this situation, to reclaim Christian holy places from Muslim control. In this context, the Mappa Mundi served a political religious function, asserting Christian claims to universal significance despite Muslim political and territorial dominance across much of the map's geography. The illustrations of monstrous races and exotic creatures at the world's edges also serve to define Christian European identity by contrast. The civilized Christian center of the world, represented by Europe and Jerusalem, stood in implicit contrast to the wild, strange, barely human creatures inhabiting the peripheries. This created a moral geography, where movement toward Jerusalem represented civilization and salvation, while movement away represented descent into barbarism and damnation. The map thus reinforced social and religious hierarchies, placing Latin Christian Europe at the center of meaningful history. Yet the maps also expressed a universalist vision, showing the entire world as subject to divine providence and potentially redeemable. Even the monstrous races, for all their strangeness, appeared within the circle of the world, potentially within reach of Christian mission. The very act of including distant peoples and places on the map, even in distorted or fantastic form, acknowledged their existence and raised questions about their spiritual status. Medieval theological debates about whether distant peoples could be saved, whether missionary efforts should reach them, whether their forms, however strange, still bore the image of God, all found visual expression in the map's inclusion of the exotic and the monstrous. The maps reflected sophisticated theological synthesis, embedding complex arguments into spatial representation. The debates about paradise's location, the nature of the antipodes, the extent of the habitable world, the boundaries of the human species, the relationship between classical learning and biblical truth, all these intellectual controversies found expression in cartographic choices. Where exactly to place the Garden of Eden, whether to include legendary islands from classical sources, how to represent the waters above and below the firmament, whether to show land south of the equator. Each decision reflected theological positions that had been debated by learned churchmen. The inclusion of classical elements alongside biblical ones demonstrated the medieval project of synthesizing pagan learning with Christian revelation. Cities from Greek and Roman history appeared on the maps. Troy, Athens, Rome, Carthage, sites of classical civilization were incorporated into Christian sacred geography. Creatures from Greco-Roman mythology found places alongside biblical beasts. The Pillars of Hercules marked the Strait of Gibraltar at the western edge of the Mediterranean. Classical geographic theories about climate zones and the sphericity of the Earth influenced the map structure, even as biblical geography determined their content. This synthesis was not seamless or without tension. Medieval scholars grappled with contradictions between classical sources and biblical accounts, between observed reality and authoritative texts, between theological requirements and geographic evidence. The Mappa Mundi represented one solution to these tensions, privileging biblical truth and theological significance while incorporating classical and contemporary knowledge in subordinate roles. The map's circular form itself might reflect both biblical imagery of the circle of the earth and classical geographic theories, merged into unified vision. As the medieval period progressed, particularly from the 13th century onward, this synthesis faced increasing pressure from new sources of geographical knowledge. The Crusades, for all their religious motivations, brought Europeans into extended contact with the Islamic world, where geographical learning had been preserved and advanced beyond medieval European levels. Arabic translations of Ptolemy and original Arabic geographical works possessed mathematical sophistication and empirical detail far exceeding the Mappa Mundi tradition. Some of this knowledge began filtering back to Europe through translation projects and the accounts of travelers. Marco Polo's journey to China and his subsequent book describing the Mongol Empire and the lands of the East introduced Europeans to geographical realities that challenged the Mappa Mundi's fantastic depictions. Polo described real cities, actual peoples, observable customs, and while his account included its share of wonders and exaggerations, it grounded the East in commercial and political reality rather than theological symbolism. The dog-headed men and single-footed monsters seemed less plausible when travelers returned with detailed accounts of actual Eastern peoples, who, however different from Europeans in custom and appearance, were recognizably human. Increasing maritime trade, particularly after the opening of Atlantic sea routes and the beginning of Mediterranean to northern European shipping, generated practical navigational knowledge that existed in growing tension with theological geography. Portolan charts, practical sailing maps showing coastlines, ports, and compass directions with reasonable accuracy, began appearing in the 13th and 14th centuries. These were working tools for mariners, stripped of theological content and focused entirely on functional navigation. They represented a different epistemology, one based on measured experience rather than revealed truth. Yet the Mappa Mundi tradition persisted alongside these developments, serving its distinct
distinctive function even as practical cartography advanced separately. The Hereford Mappa Mundi was created around 1300, the same era that saw portolan charts spreading throughout the Mediterranean. The two traditions coexisted because they served different needs and answered different questions. A ship captain needed a portolan chart to navigate from Venice to Alexandria. A Christian seeking to understand the moral structure of creation needed a Mappa Mundi to contemplate divine order. Both were maps, but maps of fundamentally different realities. The tension between these approaches would eventually resolve in favor of mathematical empirical cartography. The great age of European exploration in the 15th and 16th centuries, the circumnavigation of Africa, the discovery of the Americas, the eventual circumnavigation of the globe, all of these developments would make the Mappa Mundi's theological geography increasingly untenable. Jerusalem was demonstrably not at the world's geometric center. Paradise could not be located at any eastern extremity of an Asia that connected to Europe via continuous landmass. The dog-headed man and other monstrous races failed to appear no matter how far explorers traveled. But in the moment of their creation and for the communities that used them, Mappa Mundi represented sophisticated, coherent visions of reality that successfully integrated geography, theology, history, and moral philosophy into unified systems. To dismiss them as ignorant or inaccurate is to misunderstand their purpose and the worldview that produced them. They were not failed attempts at modern cartography, but successful expressions of medieval Christian cosmology, products of a culture that understood truth primarily as theological rather than empirical, that values spiritual significance over physical measurement, that saw the world itself as a text to be read for divine meaning rather than a space to be measured for human convenience. Standing before the Hereford Mappa Mundi and the cathedral for which it was created, medieval Christians would have experienced a comprehensive vision of their world. They would have seen themselves as participants in a cosmic drama stretching from the Garden of Eden at the beginning of time to the Last Judgment at the end. They would have understood their geographical place in relation to the spiritual center of Jerusalem. They would have encountered the wonders of creation in the exotic creatures and distant peoples populating the map's edges. They would have traced the journeys of biblical patriarchs and Christian pilgrims across the map's surface. They would have seen in visual form the fundamental Christian truth that all of creation existed within divine providence, that every place had meaning in relation to the central event of Christ's sacrifice, that the physical world was not separate from spiritual reality, but thoroughly interpenetrated by it. This vision, so alien to modern sensibilities, possessed internal coherence and provided meaningful orientation for medieval Christians navigating their world. The map told them where they were, not in terms of latitude and longitude, but in terms of spiritual geography, moral position, and participation in salvation history. It showed them a world that made sense, where every location had significance, where the strange and the familiar alike pointed toward divine truth, where the journey from the edges to the center mirrored the soul's journey from sin to salvation. The Mappa Mundi tradition represents a fundamentally different approach to understanding and representing space, one that prioritized theological truth over empirical accuracy, moral significance over practical utility, and divine order over human measurement. It was not a primitive precursor to modern cartography, but an alternative cartography based on different premises and serving different purposes. Its eclipsed by mathematical empirical mapping represents not simply progress from ignorance to knowledge, but a shift in worldview, a change in what questions we ask of maps and what truths we expect them to reveal. The medieval cartography meant they were not creating navigational tools, they were creating comprehensive visions of sacred geography, maps of a world that existed simultaneously as physical space and theological meaning, diagrams of divine order made visual through the synthesis of geography and faith. In this they succeeded brilliantly, leaving us extraordinary documents of a worldview as sophisticated as it is foreign, as internally coherent as it is empirically inaccurate, as revealing of medieval mentality as any cathedral, manuscript, or philosophical treatise from that distant age.
In 1973, Chinese archaeologists working in Hunan Province made a discovery that would rewrite the history of cartography. Deep within Tomb 3 at Mappa, sealed for more than 2,000 years, they uncovered 3 silk maps dating to approximately 168 BCE. The preservation was miraculous. The delicate fabric, painted with mineral pigments and carbon-based inks, had survived intact in the tomb's unique environmental conditions. When the archaeologists carefully unfolded these ancient documents under controlled laboratory conditions, they revealed something astonishing: sophisticated topographic maps showing rivers, mountains, roads, and settlements with remarkable accuracy and spatial awareness. These were not symbolic representations or mythological diagrams. These were practical, measurable maps created for military and administrative purposes during the Han Dynasty. The oldest of these maps depicted military garrison locations along China's southern frontier. Rivers appeared as branching blue lines, their tributaries accurately rendered. Mountains were shown in profile view, their relative heights suggested through artistic convention. Roads connected settlements marked with standardized symbols. Scale, though not indicated numerically, remained relatively consistent throughout. Most remarkably, these maps demonstrated clear understanding of spatial relationships, distance ratios, and geographic orientation. This was cartography in the fullest sense, created at a time when European mapmaking remained largely theoretical and symbolic. The Mappa discovery provided tangible evidence of what scholars had long suspected. Chinese cartographic traditions stretched back millennia, developing along trajectories entirely independent of Mediterranean and European practices. While Ptolemy would not write his Geographia for another 3 centuries, Chinese mapmakers were already creating practical territorial representations for imperial administration.
The discovery opened questions that would reshape understanding of global cartographic history. How had Chinese civilization developed such sophisticated mapping techniques so early? What philosophical frameworks and practical needs drove this development? And most intriguingly, how did Chinese cartographic traditions evolve over subsequent centuries into the remarkable maps that would astonish European visitors in the early modern period? The two maps were only the beginning of the story. They represented the foundation of a cartographic tradition that would develop with extraordinary sophistication, reaching heights that would parallel and in some respects exceed European achievements, yet remained almost entirely unknown in the West until the age of global contact. To understand Chinese cartography, one must understand that it emerged from fundamentally different imperatives than its European counterpart. While Mediterranean map-making grew from maritime trade and philosophical speculation about the Earth's shape, Chinese cartography developed primarily as a tool of imperial administration. China's vast territorial expanse, its complex river systems requiring hydraulic management, its need to coordinate military campaigns across enormous distances, and its sophisticated taxation system requiring accurate land measurement all demanded practical cartographic solutions. The emperor's mandate from heaven depended on effective governance of the terrestrial realm. Maps became instruments of power, control, and cosmic order. The philosophical foundations were distinctly Confucian. The universe was understood as an integrated system in which heaven, earth, and human society existed in harmonious relationship. The emperor, as son of heaven, mediated between celestial and terrestrial realms. Proper governance required accurate knowledge of territorial expanse and configuration. Geographic ignorance threatens the cosmic balance. Map-making thus became not merely practical, but cosmologically significant. The cartographer served the state's need for administrative efficiency, while also contributing to the maintenance of universal harmony. This dual purpose would shape Chinese cartographic development for 2 millennia. By the 3rd century CE, Chinese cartography had advanced to remarkable theoretical sophistication. The figure who would codify its principles and establish standards for centuries to come was Pei Shu, a scholar official who lived from 224 to 271 CE during the turbulent Three Kingdoms period. Appointed as Minister of Works under the Jin dynasty, Pei Shu was tasked with creating an improved map of the empire. In approaching this project, he recognized that previous maps, while useful, lacked systematic methodology. He set about establishing principles that would bring cartographic practice onto firm thematical ground. The result was his famous 6 principles of map-making, recorded in the preface to his Yugong Do2 regional map of the tribute of Yu. These principles address the fundamental technical challenges of representing a pre-domain terrain on under. The first principle, thumb loop, concerned the rectangular grid system that would become characteristic of Chinese cartography. By overlaying maps with a grid of uniform squares, cartographers could maintain consistent scale throughout the representation. Each grid square represents a standard distance, typically 100 feet, allowing accurate distance calculation between 92 points. This innovation predated European coordinate systems by more than 1 millennia. The second principle, Fund 1, address orientation and the accurate representation of cardinal directions. Maps should be properly aligned to north-south and east-west axis, with the terrain features position according to their axis. The third principle, Ptolemy, concerns the measurement and representation of distances along roads in between settlements. Accurate distance information was essential for military logistics, trade routes, and administrative communication. The fourth principle, Fellshot, dealt with implication and representation of high and low terrain. While Chinese maps typically show helens in profile view rather than using contour lines, Pei Shu recognized the importance of indicating locations for understand, corner eyes, defensive positions, and travel difficulty. The fifth principle, Fernshade, angles, and the accurate representation of directions and orientations of fronts, reversing boundaries, and cone lines. The sixth principle, Hima-G, concerns the representation of characters, primarily coming on it in course and close passage post lines. Pei Shu understood that straight lines implications could create significant errors in distance and spatial relationships. These 6 principles established Chinese cartography on systematic foundations centuries before European map-making developed decathlon through rectoplane works. Reportedly to an updates theoretical, Pei Shu applied the creating his imperial map, reportedly covering in sheets of silicon representing the entire Jin dynasty territory to an extent accuracy. Though his original hat is as soon as five consistent analysis, the standards as extreme substance consistent characteristic and not wavering from specification and below 2x confirmation from the sections containing pages of often the accuracy of material expression. The persons from the both the inner assurance, figuration, and the first auspices, first cosmic data, fermentation, record, and the document.
The production of the Kangnido also reveals the sophisticated technical capabilities of East Asian cartography in this period. The map was originally created as a painted manuscript, probably on silk, using mineral pigments and ink. The level of detail required extraordinary precision and skill. Mountains were depicted using conventional symbols, their relative positions carefully plotted. Rivers appeared as curving lines, whose courses reflected actual geographic knowledge. Cities were marked with standardized symbols indicating their administrative rank. Coastlines followed reasonably accurate contours. The compilation required not only artistic skill, but also geographic knowledge, mathematical ability to reconcile sources created at different scales, linguistic ability to read sources in Chinese and possibly Arabic or Persian, and political sensitivity to represent the various regions in ways that reflected their relative importance without creating obvious impossibilities. The Joseon court's decision to undertake this project reflected Confucian values, emphasizing learning, administrative efficiency, and cultural achievement. The dynasty sought to legitimate itself through scholarship and good governance. A comprehensive world map demonstrated both intellectual sophistication and practical administrative capacity. The map was not merely decorative but functional, serving as reference for diplomatic relations, tribute missions, and understanding Korea's place in the regional order. The original 1402 Kangnido has not survived, but several later copies exist, the most important dating from the late 15th and early 16th centuries. These copies, preserved in Japanese collections, allow modern scholars to reconstruct the original's essential features and study its cartographic characteristics. The preservation itself is historically significant. The maps entered Japanese collections during the Japanese invasions of Korea in the 1590s, when Korean cultural treasures were systematically looted. The irony that these maps survived in Japan, while Korean originals were lost, reflects the tragic history of East Asian warfare and cultural destruction. The Kangnido influenced subsequent cartography throughout East Asia. Chinese mapmakers in the Ming Dynasty, 1368 to 1644, created similar comprehensive world maps incorporating Islamic geographic knowledge. Japanese cartographers adapted the Kangnido's approach to create their own world maps, naturally enlarging Japan while retaining the basic Chinese-centered composition. The map established a template for East Asian world representation that would persist until Western cartographic knowledge arrived in the 16th and 17th centuries. The sophistication of East Asian cartography extended beyond comprehensive world maps to specialized cartographic forms. Military maps used standardized symbols for fortifications, troop positions, and strategic terrain. Hydrographic maps depicted rivers and canals with detailed information about depths, currents, seasonal variations, and bridge locations, essential for managing China's complex hydraulic infrastructure. Provincial and local maps provide administrative information about county boundaries, tax districts, population centers, and agricultural lands. Coastal maps supported maritime defense and trade. Historical maps illustrated the changing boundaries of dynasties and kingdoms over time. This diversity of cartographic types reflected sophisticated understanding of how different purposes required different cartographic approaches and contents. The technical production of maps in China also reached levels unmatched in medieval Europe. The development of woodblock printing technology in the Tang Dynasty and its refinement in subsequent periods allowed map reproduction in quantities impossible in the West until the advent of printing. A map could be carved into wooden blocks, inked, and printed repeatedly with consistent quality. This technology enabled inclusion of maps in books, dissemination to provincial officials throughout the empire, and even commercial sale to private individuals. The Ming Dynasty saw extensive publication of geographic works with accompanying maps. The Da Ming Yi Tong Ji, comprehensive gazetteer of the Great Ming, compiled in the 15th century, provided systematic geographic information about every province and prefecture, accompanied by maps. This massive work, running to 90 chapters, represented systematic compilation of administrative geography on a scale unprecedented in world history. Imperial workshops employed teams of specialized craftsmen who carved the intricate woodblocks required for map printing. The precision required was extraordinary. Geographic features must be clearly rendered, text must be legible, and multiple blocks must align perfectly when different colors were printed in registration. The technical excellence of Chinese woodblock printing supported cartographic dissemination throughout the empire and beyond. But this sophisticated cartographic tradition developed in relative isolation from European practices. Despite the brief contacts of a Mongol period, Chinese and European map-making proceeded along largely independent trajectories for centuries. Each tradition developed distinctive characteristics reflecting different needs, philosophies, and technical capabilities. Chinese cartography excelled in territorial representation, administrative detail, and systematic compilation. European cartography increasingly focused on maritime navigation, mathematical projection, and global coverage through exploration. Both traditions achieved genuine sophistication, but in different domains and for different purposes. The encounter between these parallel traditions would come in the early modern period, and it would be dramatic. The catalyst was Matteo Ricci, the Italian Jesuit missionary who arrived in China in 1582, and would spend the next 28 years attempting to introduce European knowledge, including cartography, to the Chinese imperial court. Ricci was a sophisticated scholar, trained in mathematics, astronomy, and geography at the Jesuit Collegio Romano in Rome. He recognized that scientific knowledge could serve as a bridge to Chinese intellectuals and potentially facilitate Christian missionary work. Among the items he brought to China were European world maps. In 1602, at the request of Chinese literati, Ricci created a world map adapted specifically for Chinese audiences. His Kunyu Wangguo Quantu, complete map of the myriad countries of the world, synthesized European geographic knowledge while accommodating Chinese sensibilities.
Recognizing the Chinese concept of the Middle Kingdom, Ricci placed China near the center of his map rather than using the European convention of centering on the prime meridian running through Europe. He included extensive annotations in Chinese explaining geographic features, cultures, and distances. He incorporated Chinese geographic knowledge of East Asia while providing European information about the Americas, which had been entirely unknown to Chinese cartographers. The map was a technical marvel by any standard. It used European projection techniques to represent the spherical Earth on a flat surface, while maintaining reasonable accuracy, showed all continents including the recently discovered Americas, depicted parallels and meridians, and included extensive geographic information drawn from contemporary European sources. The reaction of Chinese scholars to Ricci's map was complex and revealing. On one level, there was genuine fascination. The map contained vast amounts of new information about regions Chinese cartographers had represented vaguely or not at all. The Americas were entirely new knowledge. The accurate representation of Africa's full extent exceeded what Islamic sources had provided. The use of mathematical projection created an overall coherence that synthesized global geography in ways Chinese maps had not attempted. Some Chinese intellectuals recognized the map's technical sophistication and welcomed the expansion of geographic knowledge. But there was also profound discomfort, even crisis. Ricci's map displaced China from the literal center of the world. On a mathematically projected global map, China appeared in the eastern portion, not the middle. It was shown as large, but not uniquely central. Europe appeared as a substantial continent, not a negligible peripheral peninsula. The map challenged fundamental causological assumptions about China's centrality to civilization. For some Chinese scholars, this was philosophically intolerable. How could the Middle Kingdom not be in the middle? How could distant barbarian lands appear as substantial and important as the civilized Rome? Ricci's map, for all its technical excellence, threatened the conceptual foundations of Chinese self-understanding and world order. Some scholars rejected the map entirely as barbarian fantasy. Others attempted to reconcile it with tradition of Chinese cosmology by arguing that the heavens were round but the earth was flat, so Chinese maps showing China at the center of a flat earth remained valid, while Ricci's curved projection represented a different perspective. Still others accepted the new geographic knowledge while seeking to minimize its implications for Chinese centrality. Ricci himself recorded some of these reactions with amused frustration, noting that Chinese scholars simultaneously admired the map's detail while rejected its implications. The encounter represented a fundamental clash of worldviews. European cartography had developed increasingly toward mathematical accuracy and empirical verification, accepting whatever results followed from systematic observation and measurement. Chinese cartography, while technically sophisticated, had never divorced geographic representation from cosmological and political meaning. Maps were not merely descriptions of physical space, but representations of cultural hierarchy and cosmic order. A map that displaced China from its central position was not simply inaccurate, but philosophically wrong, regardless of mathematical measurements. This tension between empirical accuracy and cultural meaning would continue to characterize Chinese responses to European geography throughout the 17th and early 18th centuries. The Qing dynasty, 1644 to 1912, established by Manchurian conquest but quickly adopting Chinese administrative and cultural systems, would eventually sponsor massive cartographic projects synthesizing European techniques with Chinese knowledge, but always maintaining China's conceptual centrality even as global geography was increasingly accepted. The Jesuit presence at a Qing court facilitated ongoing cartographic exchange. Jesuit astronomers and mathematicians served the emperor, including creating detailed maps of the Chinese Empire using European European techniques. The Kangxi Empire, r. 1616 to 1722, himself an enthusiastic student of mathematics and astronomy, sponsored a comprehensive survey of the empire using trigonometric methods. The resulting Kangxi Atlas, completed in 1719, represented China's provinces with unprecedented accuracy, using European projection and measurement techniques, while maintaining Chinese cartographic conventions for symbols and annotation. This synthesis demonstrated that technical borrowing was possible, without wholesale abandonment of Chinese cartographic tradition. The encounter between Chinese and European cartography also reveals the cultural contingency of map-making practices. Both traditions had developed sophisticated techniques and achieved genuine accuracy within their domains of focus. Chinese grid-based territorial maps of the empire were as accurate as contemporary European maps of their territories. European maritime charts and global projections reflected specialized knowledge of navigation and exploration that Chinese cartographers lacked, but each tradition embedded its technical practices within broader cultural assumptions about what maps were for, what they should represent, and what constituted accuracy. For Chinese cartographers, accurate representation of administrative hierarchies, cultural significance, and cosmic order was as important as geometric precision. For European cartographers, increasingly influenced by the scientific revolution's emphasis on measurement and empirical verification, geometric accuracy became the paramount virtue, with cultural meaning relegated to decorative elements or textual annotations, rather than spatial arrangement. Neither approach was inherently superior, each served different needs and reflected different values. The history of East Asian cartography also highlights the importance of practical needs in driving technical development. Chinese map-making achieved sophistication because the empire's administrative requirements demanded it. Managing a vast territory with complex river systems, diverse environments, and enormous population required accurate geographic information. Tax collection, military logistics, water management, famine relief, postal systems, and administrative communication all depended on knowing where places were, how they were connected, and what resources they contained. The imperial bureaucracy institutionalized cartographic production as essential governmental function. Map-making bureaus employed scholar officials who collected geographic data, compiled maps, and maintained official atlases. This systematic state-sponsored cartography assured both technical excellence and continuous development. In contrast, European cartography in the medieval period lacked comparable institutional support. Most maps were produced in monasteries or by individual scholars without systematic coordination. The practical leads that would drive European cartographic development, maritime navigation for trade and exploration, would only intensify in the 15th and 16th centuries with oceanic expansion. Until then, European cartography remained more theoretical and less practically oriented than its Chinese counterpart. The story of Chinese cartography and its culmination in the Kangnido reveals several broader truths about how human societies represent space and understand their place in the world. First, all maps reflect the worldview and priorities of their creators.
creators, the choice of what to include, how to represent it, how to orient the map, what to place at the center, and how to handle scale and proportion, all embody cultural values and assumptions. The Kangnido placed China at the center and enlarged Korea because this reflected the mapmaker's understanding of cultural importance. European medieval Mappa Mundi placed Jerusalem at the center because it was understood as spiritually central to human history. No map is a neutral, objective representation. All maps are arguments about what matters. Second, cartographic sophistication can develop in multiple cultural contexts through different pathways. Chinese cartography reached high levels of accuracy and technical refinement through focus on territorial administration. European cartography would reach different kinds of sophistication through focus on maritime navigation and global exploration. Islamic cartography developed its own sophisticated traditions emphasizing mathematical geography and regional description. Each tradition had distinctive strengths reflecting the practical needs and intellectual frameworks of the cultures that produced them. The encounter between these cartographic traditions can be profoundly unsettling, as maps encode fundamental assumptions about the world and humanity's place in it. When Ricci showed his world map to Chinese scholars, he was not simply providing new information but challenging cosmological foundations. The displacement of China from the center was not a trivial correction but a philosophical crisis. Similarly, when Europeans first encountered the Kangnido and other Chinese maps, they were confronted with a completely different perspective in which Europe appeared insignificant. These encounters forced recognition that one's own worldview was not universal but particular, not absolute but contingent. Finally, the history of Chinese cartography demonstrates that technological sophistication and scientific accuracy are not unique to Western civilization. The assumption that European uniquely developed rational systematic empirical approaches to knowledge, including cartography, has been thoroughly disproven by examining other traditions. Chinese cartographers were using coordinate grids and systematic measurement principles in the 3rd century CE, 1,000 years before Europeans developed equivalent techniques. The Kangnido represented African geography more accurately than contemporary European maps. Chinese woodblock printing allowed map dissemination centuries before European printing. The story of cartography is global, not European, and recognizing this changes how we understand the development of human.
The year is 813 CE, and in the heart of Baghdad, along the banks of the Tigris River, an institution is taking shape that will transform human knowledge for centuries to come. The House of Wisdom, or Beit al-Hikmah, commissioned by the Abbasid Caliph al-Mamun, has become more than a library or translation academy. It is an intellectual crucible where the geographic knowledge of antiquity is being preserved, corrected, and dramatically expanded by some of history's most brilliant minds. Walk through its arched corridors on any given morning, and you would encounter scholars from across the known world, Persians, Arabs, Christians, Jews, and converts from distant lands, all united by an insatiable hunger for knowledge. The air is thick with incense and the subtle scent of ink, parchment, and aged leather bindings. In one chamber, translators hunched over Greek manuscripts painstakingly render Ptolemy's Geographia into Arabic, their reed pens scratching methodically across fresh vellum. In another room, astronomers debate the finer points of celestial mechanics while consulting elaborate brass astrolabes that catch and fracture the golden light streaming through latticed windows. This is the Islamic Golden Age of geographic science, a period spanning roughly from the 8th to the 15th centuries, when Muslim scholars did not merely preserve the geographic knowledge of the Greeks and Romans, but systematically corrected, expanded, and revolutionized it. While Europe languished in what historians once dismissively called the Dark Ages, producing symbolic maps more concerned with theological geography than terrestrial accuracy, the Islamic world was conducting geodetic measurements, calculating the Earth's circumference with remarkable precision, and creating maps of unprecedented detail and accuracy. The story of Islamic geography begins not with conquest, but with curiosity, motivated by both religious imperatives and intellectual ambition. For Muslims, geographic knowledge was never merely academic. It was a fundamental religious necessity. 5 times daily, every Muslim must face Mecca in prayer, a requirement that demands precise geographic knowledge of the Qibla direction from any location on Earth. The annual Hajj pilgrimage to Mecca requires detailed information about routes, distances, and the geography of the Arabian Peninsula. These religious obligations created practical demands that transformed geography from philosophical speculation into applied science. Moreover, the rapid expansion of Islam in its 1st century created an empire stretching from the Iberian Peninsula to the borders of India and China, encompassing regions with diverse climates, peoples, and resources. Governing such a vast territory required accurate geographic information. Where were the major cities? How distant were they from each other? What routes connected them? What were the natural resources of each region? What peoples inhabited the borderlands? The Abbasid Caliphate's administration needed maps and geographic texts as practical tools of governance and commerce. It was within this context that the Great Translation movement began. Under the patronage of enlightened caliphs, particularly al-Mamun, who ruled from 813 to 833 CE, scholars embarked on an ambitious project to translate into Arabic the scientific and philosophical works of the Greeks, Persians, and Indians. Ptolemy's Geographia, with its gazetteer of some 8,000 locations and instructions for creating world maps, was among the treasures rendered into Arabic. But Islamic scholars did not simply translate. They immediately recognized Ptolemy's errors and set about correcting them.
One of the first great Islamic geographers was Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi, whose name gives us the word algorithm, and whose work in the 9th century established foundations for mathematical geography. Al-Khwarizmi produced the Kitab Surat al-Ard, or Book of the Description of the Earth, which systematically revised Ptolemy's coordinates based on new astronomical observations and reports from travelers. Where Ptolemy had vastly exaggerated the length of the Mediterranean Sea, Al-Khwarizmi corrected it. Where Ptolemy's data on Asia was vague or fantastic, Al-Khwarizmi incorporated information from merchants who had actually traveled the Silk Road. In Al-Khwarizmi's work, we see a fundamental shift in cartographic methodology. Rather than simply accepting ancient authority, Islamic geographers developed a system of continuous empirical verification. Travelers, merchants, pilgrims, and military expeditions were systematically interviewed and their observations recorded. Astronomical observations were conducted at multiple locations to determine precise latitudes. Mathematical instruments were refined to improve the accuracy of these measurements. Geography became an empirical science grounded in observation and measurement rather than inherited tradition. The astronomical dimension of Islamic geography cannot be overstated. Muslim astronomers developed increasingly sophisticated instruments for measuring celestial positions and determining terrestrial coordinates. The astrolabe, though invented earlier, was perfected by Islamic craftsmen into an instrument of remarkable precision and beauty. These brass devices, often engraved with intricate geometric patterns and calibrated scales, could determine latitude by measuring the altitude of the sun or stars, calculate the time of day or night, and solve various trigonometric problems essential for navigation and cartography. The quadrant, a quarter-circle instrument used for measuring angles, was refined and employed in observatories from Baghdad to Samarkand to Moraga. Enormous mural quadrants, some with radii of 40 meters, were constructed in major observatories, allowing measurements of celestial positions with precision that would not be exceeded until the invention of the telescope. These astronomical observations served geographic purposes, determining the latitude of major cities, calculating the distances between them, and establishing the Qibla direction with mathematical precision. By the 10th century, Islamic geographic science had developed distinct schools and methodologies. The mathematical school, following Al-Khwarizmi's approach, emphasized astronomical coordinates and mathematical cartography. The descriptive school focused on detailed written accounts of regions, cities, routes, and peoples, producing the genre known as Masalik wa Mamalik, or roads and kingdoms literature. The cartographic school created actual maps, both world maps showing the entire known world and regional maps detailing specific areas. One of the great works of the descriptive school was Ibn Khordadbeh's Book of Roads and Kingdoms, completed around 870 CE. As the Abbasid Caliphate's director of posts and intelligence, Ibn Khordadbeh had access to official reports from throughout the empire. His work described postal routes with precise distances, listed provinces and their revenues, and included information about foreign lands, including detailed accounts of China and the Byzantine Empire. This was practical geography in service of empire, a guidebook for administrators, merchants, and messengers. Another towering figure of this period was al-Masudi, a 10th century scholar often called the Herodotus of the Arabs. Al-Masudi was not content to compile others' reports. He traveled extensively himself, journeying to Persia, India, Sri Lanka, and East Africa. His monumental work, Meadows of Gold and Mines of Gems, combined geography with history, anthropology, and natural science. He described the monsoon winds that governed Indian Ocean navigation, discussed
The intellectual framework of Islamic geography was also enriched by theoretical contributions. Ibn Khaldun, the 14th century North African scholar, often considered a founder of sociology and historiography, developed a sophisticated theory of environmental determinism in his Muqaddimah. Ibn Khaldun argued that climate zones fundamentally shaped human societies. Temperate zones produce civilizations characterized by moderation and cultural achievement, while extreme climates of excessive heat or cold produce peoples with different characteristics. Though modern scholarship has rightly criticized environmental determinism's oversimplifications, Ibn Khaldun's work represented an attempt to theorize the relationship between geography and human society in systematic fashion. The question of why the Islamic world produced such sophisticated geographic science during the medieval period has multiple answers. The vast extent of the Islamic world, spanning diverse climates and regions across 3 continents, facilitated information gathering on an unprecedented scale. The unity provided by shared language, religion, and scholarly culture enabled the circulation and synthesis of knowledge from disparate sources. The practical motivations of religious obligation, administrative necessity, and commercial interest created demand for accurate geographic information. The intellectual culture that valued empirical observation and mathematical rigor provided methodological frameworks for advancing beyond ancient authorities. Economic factors were also crucial. The Islamic world's position astride major trade routes connecting Europe, Africa, and Asia generated wealth that could support scholarly activity. Merchants traveling these routes continuously gathered geographic information, creating a feedback loop where commercial activity generated knowledge and knowledge facilitated commerce.
The institution of waqf, religious endowments that fund mosques, schools, hospitals, and libraries, provided stable financial support for scholarly work, including geographic research. The transmission of Islamic geographic knowledge to Europe occurred gradually through multiple channels. In the Iberian Peninsula, where Christian, Muslim, and Jewish communities coexisted and competed for centuries, translation schools emerged, most famously in Toledo after its conquest by Christian forces in 1085. Here, teams of translators rendered Arabic texts into Latin and Romance languages. Al-Khwarizmi's geographic works were translated, introducing European scholars to corrected versions of Ptolemy's coordinates. Al-Idrisi's works, already created in Sicily's multicultural environment, circulated in both Arabic and Latin versions. These translations had profound effects on European geography. They revealed the limitations of contemporary European maps, which were often schematic diagrams more concerned with theological symbolism than terrestrial accuracy. They introduced mathematical techniques for determining positions and calculating distances. They provided detailed information about regions of Asia and Africa largely unknown in Europe. The Islamic geographic legacy thus became a foundation for the European age of exploration, as Renaissance navigators and cartographers built upon knowledge preserved and extended by Muslim scholars. Comparing Islamic maps with contemporary European examples reveals striking differences in approach and accuracy. While European Mappa Mundi, like the Hereford map, placed Jerusalem at the world's center and depicted geography through the lens of biblical narrative, Islamic maps attempted to render the world with spatial accuracy. While European maps often included fantastic creatures and theological symbolism, Islamic maps focused on empirical features, coastlines, rivers, mountains, and cities. While European maps provided little practical utility for navigation or travel, Islamic maps served functional purposes of route finding, qibla determination, and geographic understanding. This is not to romanticize or create a simplistic East versus West narrative. Islamic cartography had its own limitations and conventions. The symbolic representation of rivers and mountains often followed schematic patterns rather than precise rendering. The information about distant regions depended on travelers' reports that could be inaccurate or exaggerated. The focus on the Islamic world meant that peripheral regions were less accurately represented. Nevertheless, the relative emphasis on empirical accuracy, systematic correction of errors, and practical application distinguished Islamic geographic science from contemporary European practice. The instruments developed by Islamist scholars for astronomical and geographic purposes represent another dimension of their achievement. The astrolabe, perfected into an instrument of remarkable versatility, could solve a wide range of problems, determining time of day or night from celestial observations, calculating the qibla direction, finding latitude, converting between celestial coordinate systems, and even casting horoscopes. These brass instruments, engraved with intricate scales and often decorated with geometric patterns, were marvels of engineering and craftsmanship. The construction of large observatories represented institutional commitment to astronomical and geographic science. The Maraga Observatory in northwestern Iran, established in the 13th century by Nasr al-Din al-Tusi under Mongol patronage, included multiple buildings housing various instruments, a library containing hundreds of scientific manuscripts, and facilities for instrument construction. Here, astronomers conducted systematic observations that refined celestial models and provided data for geographic coordinate tables. Similar observatories in Samarkand, Cairo, and other centers created networks of coordinated observation that improved the accuracy of geographic knowledge. The geographic literature of the Islamic Golden Age also included specialized works addressing specific topics. Books on seas and navigation described maritime routes, harbors, and sailing techniques. Texts on agricultural geography analyzed the relationship between climate, soil, water resources, and crop cultivation. Urban geographic works described cities, their layouts, water systems, and monuments. This specialization reflected the sophistication and diversity of Islamic geographic science. The role of patronage in supporting the scientific flowering cannot be overlooked. Enlightened rulers recognized that geographic knowledge served practical purposes. Military campaigns required maps and route information. Tax collection required knowing provincial boundaries and resources. Long-distance trade required understanding of routes and markets. But patronage also reflected genuine intellectual curiosity and the prestige associated with supporting scholarship. The competition among regional courts to attract the most accomplished scholars created favorable conditions for scientific work. The case of Al-Idrisi illustrates this dynamic. King Roger II of Sicily was himself an educated man with genuine interest in geography. He provided Al-Idrisi not just financial support, but access to resources, the ability to send expeditions to gather data, to consult the reports of merchants and travelers passing through Sicily's busy ports, to dedicate years to the project without financial pressure. The resulting tabula Rogerana benefited both patron and scholar. Roger gained a prestigious accomplishment and useful geographic knowledge, while Idrisi secured the resources necessary for his monumental work. The integration of different knowledge traditions was another distinctive feature of Islamic geographic science. Muslim scholars did not simply preserve Greek geographic knowledge, they combined it with Persian administrative geography, Indian mathematical techniques, and Chinese cartographic practices encountered along the Silk Road. This synthesis created a geographic science richer than any single tradition could have produced.
The willingness to learn from and integrate diverse sources reflected in intellectual cosmopolitanism that transcended cultural boundaries. This cosmopolitanism is evident in the biographies of leading Islamic geographers. Al-Idrisi was born in Morocco, studied in Cordoba, traveled widely in the Mediterranean and possibly to England, and produced his masterwork in Sicily. Al-Biruni was born in Khwarazm in Central Asia, lived in the courts of various Central Asian rulers, spent years in India, and wrote in both Arabic and Persian. Ibn Battuta journeyed across the entire Islamic world and beyond. These scholars were citizens of a civilization that, despite political fragmentation, was unified by shared intellectual and religious culture. The astronomical tables, or zijes, compiled by Islamic astronomers served important geographic functions. These comprehensive handbooks included coordinates of major cities, instructions for determining qibla direction, methods for calculating visibility of the new moon for Islamic calendar purposes, and tables of celestial positions. The Toledo intervals, compiled in 11th century Islamic Spain and later translated into Latin, became standard references in medieval Europe. Such works represented the accumulation of centuries of observation and calculation. The concept of iklim, or climate zones, inherited from Greek geography but refined by Islamic scholars, organized much geographic thinking. The world was divided into 7 latitudinal zones, each with characteristic climate, peoples, and resources. This framework, while based partly on theory and partly on observation, provided a systematic way of organizing geographic information. Al-Idrisi's Tabula Rajarana was organized according to these zones, as were many other geographic texts. The climate zone concept represented an attempt to theorize global patterns and regularities in geographic phenomena. The accuracy of Islamic geographic knowledge can be assessed by comparing their calculations with modern values. Al-Biruni's measurement of the Earth's circumference was accurate to within 1%. Al-Khwarizmi's correction of Ptolemy's Mediterranean length, while still imperfect, was much closer to reality than Ptolemy's figure. The coordinates provided in various sieges for major cities are recognizably accurate, differing from modern values by degrees that represent the inherent limitations of medieval instruments rather than fundamental methodological errors. This accuracy resulted from the systematic application of mathematical techniques to empirical observations. The decline of Islamic geographic science from its medieval heights is a complex story related to broader patterns of political fragmentation, economic disruption, and intellectual stagnation. The Mongol invasions of the 13th century devastated some of the great centers of Islamic learning, including the sack of Baghdad in 1258 that destroyed the House of Wisdom and countless manuscripts. The gradual shift of economic power as European maritime exploration opened new trade routes. It is the centrality of the Islamic world in global commerce. Internal factors, including the closing of ijtihad or independent reasoning in some Islamic legal traditions, may have contributed to intellectual conservatism. However, the narrative of decline should not obscure the fact that Islamic geographic knowledge profoundly influenced the Renaissance and Age of Exploration. When Portuguese navigators began exploring the Africa coast in the 15th century, they relied partly on information preserved in Arabic sources. When Columbus sailed westward, he carried a Latin version of Al-Idrisi's work. When Renaissance cartographers created new world maps, they incorporated knowledge transmitted from Islamic sources. The Islamic geographic legacy did not simply end, it was absorbed into the emerging European scientific tradition. The visual aesthetics of Islamic cartography deserve attention. Maps were often illuminated with gold leaf and vibrant pigments. Geometric patterns, the hallmark of Islamic artistic traditions, decorated map borders and filled cartouches. Calligraphy transformed place names into visual artistic. Mountains were represented as rhythmic patterns of curved forms. Rivers flowed in elegant sinuous lines. Cities were indicated by circular symbols, often rendered in gold. These aesthetic choices created maps that were simultaneously scientific instruments and objects of beauty, reflecting the Islamic tradition's integration of art and science. The manuscript culture that preserved and transmitted Islamic geographic knowledge involved networks of copyists, illuminators, and patrons. Important texts were copied multiple times, with each copy potentially introducing new information or corrections. Marginal annotations by readers added layers of knowledge to the original text. Comparing different manuscript versions of the same font revealed how geographic knowledge was continuously updated and refined. This manuscript tradition, while lacking the standardization that printing would later provide, enabled the preservation and circulation of knowledge across centuries and contents. The theological underpinnings of the Islamic geographic science also merit consideration. The Quranic emphasis on signs of God and nature encouraged observation of the physical world. Verses describing natural phenomena, the diversity of peoples and languages, and the vastness of creation provided religious justification for geographic inquiry. The concept of human beings as Khalifa, or stewards of the earth, implied a responsibility to understand creation. This theological framework supported rather than hindered scientific investigation, at least during the Golden Age. The practical manuals for the Qibla and Qibla direction represented the intersection of mathematics, astronomy, and geography in service of religious practice. Various methods were developed, using stellar observations and mathematical calculations, employing special instruments designed for Qibla determination, consulting tables that provide Qibla directions from various cities, and constructing diagrams that could be used to find the direction geometrically. The sophistication of these methods reflected the importance of the problem, and the mathematical skills brought the very part. The geographic sections of comprehensive encyclopedias compiled
in a stone-walled workshop overlooking the harbor of Venice in the year 1320, a master cartographer named Pietro Visconti bends over a sheet of prepared calfskin vellum, his experienced hands steady despite his 60 years. The afternoon light slanting through the workshop's narrow window catches the compass rose he's just completed in gold leaf and vermilion, making it seem to glow with its own inner fire. Around him, the tools of his specialized trade lie arranged with careful precision: brass dividers worn smooth by decades of use, quills cut from goose feathers, ceramic pots containing inks mixed from lampblack and precious pigments, a lodestone mounted in cork floating in a bowl of water, and most importantly, the reference charts and notebooks filled with coastal measurements, harbor descriptions, and navigational details accumulated through a lifetime of correspondence with ship's pilots, merchants, and fellow cartographers throughout the Mediterranean world. Visconti is creating a portolan chart, a type of map that represents one of the most significant yet mysterious innovations in the history of cartography. Unlike the theological Mappa Mundi adorning monastery walls, or the theoretical geographic treatises copied in university scriptoria, portolan charts are working documents, practical tools designed for a single purpose, getting ships safely from one port to another across the Mediterranean's complex waters. They embody a radically different approach to representing geographical space, one based not on cosmological theory, religious symbolism, or ancient textual authority, but on accumulated empirical observation, the collective experiential knowledge of generations of sailors who knew every harbor, headland, and hazardous shoal from Gibraltar to Constantinople. The transformation these charts represented cannot be overstated. While contemporary world maps still showed Jerusalem at the center of a circular Earth, portrayed seas as decorative blue zones populated by sea monsters, and shaped continents according to theological convenience, portolan charts depicted coastlines with an accuracy that wouldn't be substantially improved for centuries. They achieved this precision through a bottom-up epistemology, building knowledge not from theoretical principles, but from countless individual observations. A pilot noting the bearing from Cape Bon to Sicily, another measuring distances by a day's sail with favorable winds, a third recording the distinctive profile of mountains visible from sea that confirmed its ship's position. This was empiricism in its purest form, knowledge validated not by its correspondence to ancient authorities, but by whether it successfully guided ships to their destinations. Visconti dips his finest quill into the black ink and begins inscribing place names along the coastline he's already outlined. His lettering is perpendicular to the coast, extending inland in dense clusters where ports are numerous, sparser in regions where harbors are scarce. Messina, Palermo, Trapani, Marsala, each name represents not just a geographical location, but a commercial center, a safe anchorage, a place where ships can take on water and provisions or shelter from storms. The names themselves are multilingual, reflecting the Mediterranean's cosmopolitan maritime culture. Italian, Catalan, Arabic, Greek, all intermixed along shorelines that have been crossed by trading ships since before written history. This linguistic diversity speaks to the international character of medieval Mediterranean commerce and to the shared knowledge base that transcended political boundaries. A Venetian captain needed to navigate to Alexandria, a Genoese merchant to Tunis, a Catalan trader to Byzantium. Portolan charts serve them all, their practical utility making them valuable far beyond their cities of origin. The most visually distinctive feature of portolan charts is the network of rhumb lines radiating across their surfaces from multiple compass roses. Visconti has already drawn his primary rose near the center of the chart, dividing the circle into 16 directions corresponding to the winds, Tramontana to the north, Greco to the northeast, Levante to the east, and so forth, following the traditional nomenclature used by Mediterranean sailors. From this central rose, he's drawn 16 lines extending to the chart's edges, creating the primary directional framework. Now he draws secondary roses at strategic points, usually 16 in total, arranged in a circle at the edges of the chart. From each of these roses, 16 more lines radiate outward, creating a complex geometric web that covers the entire chart surface. The lines are drawn in different colors, black for the 8 principal directions, green for the 8 half winds, red for the 16 quarter winds, creating a pattern of extraordinary mathematical beauty that serves an eminently practical purpose. These rhumb lines are the key to the chart's navigational function. A pilot wishing to sail from one port to another would place a straight edge, often the edge of a parallel ruler or even a taut thread, connecting his current location to his destination. He would then note which rhumb line this course most closely paralleled. If, for instance, the line ran parallel to a red rhumb, he could trace that rhumb back to its compass rose origin and determine the precise compass bearing he needed to follow. This bearing, expressed in terms of the named winds or as points of the compass, would then guide the helmsman's steering. The method was elegant in its simplicity, requiring no complex calculations, only careful observation and the ability to maintain a steady course. Combined with estimates of distance made by dead reckoning, calculating speed and direction over time, this approach allowed navigators to cross open water with remarkable confidence, no longer needing to hug coastlines or rely solely on landmark navigation. What makes portolan charts truly extraordinary is their sudden appearance in the historical record. The oldest surviving examples date from the late 13th century, and they appear essentially fully formed, exhibiting all the characteristic features and impressive accuracy that would define the tradition for the next 3 centuries. There's no evident evolutionary development, no progression from crude early attempts to refined later versions. The Carte Pisane, generally considered the oldest surviving portolan chart and dated to approximately 1290, already shows the Mediterranean with such precision that when its coastlines are compared to modern satellite imagery, the correlation is astonishing. This has led to one of cartography's most intriguing mysteries.
portolan charts must have had predecessors, earlier versions that were refined over time through accumulated corrections and additions, yet no such evolutionary sequence survives in the historical record. Were earlier charts used until they literally fell apart, discarded once better versions became available? Were the techniques developed in some center where charts were so valuable they were carefully guarded and eventually lost? Or do the surviving charts represent the crystallization of practical navigational knowledge that had been transmitted orally or through sketches for generations before someone finally systematized it into the standardized format? The geographic coverage of portolan charts reveals much about the maritime world that created them. The earliest charts focus intensively on the Mediterranean, with every detail of its coastlines rendered with obsessive precision. The Black Sea, connected to Mediterranean trade through the Genoese and Venetian colonies that dotted its shores, appears with similar accuracy. The Atlantic coasts of Iberia and Morocco are included, though with slightly less detail, reflecting the newer and less intensive maritime activity in these regions during the 13th century. Intriguingly, the Atlantic coasts of France and Britain, when included at all, show noticeably less accuracy than Mediterranean shores, not because the cartographers lacked skill, but because they lacked data. Fewer ships sailed those routes, fewer pilots contributed observations, and the knowledge base was correspondingly thinner. This differential accuracy serves as a precise map not of geography per se, but of maritime activity, showing us exactly which routes were regularly traveled and which remained peripheral to Mediterranean commercial networks. Visconti now adds the decorative elements that mark a chart as the work of a master craftsman. He paints miniature representations of major cities, Venice shown with its distinctive campanile, Genoa with its lighthouse, Alexandria with stylized minarets, each rendered in careful detail despite being less than a centimeter tall. These illustrations serve multiple purposes. They make prominent ports easily recognizable at a glance, they add aesthetic value that justifies the chart's considerable cost, and they signal the cultural identity of important places in the maritime network. The religious symbolism is subtle but present. Crosses mark Christian cities, crescents indicate Muslim ports, a reminder that the Mediterranean remained a frontier zone where Christendom and Islam met in both commerce and conflict. Yet the chart's primary orientation is commercial rather than religious. What matters most is not theological affiliation, but whether a port is accessible, safe, and offers profitable trading opportunities. The accuracy of portolan charts raise fascinating technical questions that scholars have debated for centuries. How did medieval navigators achieve such precision without the ability to calculate longitude? The answer lies in the maritime culture's sophisticated integration of multiple observational techniques. Dead reckoning provided distance estimates based on speed and time. A practiced pilot could estimate his ship's speed by watching seaweed pass the hull or by the feel of the wind and sea. Direction came from magnetic compasses, which had become standard maritime equipment in the Mediterranean by the 13th century. Coastal profiles, carefully memorized or described in written sailing directions called portolans, from which the charts likely took their name, allowed pilots to identify their position when within sight of land. Depth soundings revealed underwater topography, helping navigators recognize their location even at fog. The altitude of the North Star or Sun, measured with cross staffs or quadrants, provided latitude information, though this technique became more systematically used in later centuries. Most crucially, the charts incorporated corrections from countless voyages. Each time a pilot found a bearing or distance to be slightly off, that information could be fed back to chart makers, gradually refining the representation toward ever greater accuracy. The social world of chart making was highly specialized and often secretive. Cartographers formed professional guilds, with Venice, Genoa, Majorca, and later Lixamil becoming major centers of production. The craft frequently passed from father to son, with family workshops maintaining their reputations across generations. The Visconti family in Venice, the Crescase in Majorca, the Maggiolo Havili in Genoa, these dynastic workshops became synonymous with quality, their charts commanding premium prices from wealthy merchants and ship owners. The techniques themselves were closely guarded. A truly excellent chart represented valuable intellectual property that provided competitive advantage to its owner. Some of the most accurate charts were state secrets. The Portuguese and Spanish crowns during the 15th and 16th centuries attempted to control access to charts showing newly explored African and American coastlines, recognizing that geographical knowledge translated directly into commercial and military power. In Visconti's workshop, the process of creating a chart follows procedures refined through decades of practice. The vellum must be prepared with meticulous care. Calfskin or sheepskin scraped thin, treated with chalk and pumice to create a surface that will accept ink without bleeding, cut to size, and sometimes pieced together multiple sheets when large charts are required. The cartographer begins by establishing the geometric framework, carefully drawing the primary compass rose and using straight edge and dividers to construct the network of rhumb lines with mathematical precision. Any error in this foundational geometry would propagate throughout the chart, making accurate navigation impossible. Once the geometric framework is established, the coastlines can be drawn, plotted according to the bearings and distances recorded in the cartographer's reference materials. This is where the master's skill and knowledge are else mindful, synthesizing information from multiple sources, reconciling contradictory reports, making judgments about which observations are reliable and which might reflect errors. The economic value of portolan charts was substantial. A good chart from a reputable workshop might cost as much as a skilled artisan earned in several months. Yet for a merchant whose entire fortune might be invested in a cargo shipment, or a ship owner whose vessel represented the accumulated capital of years of trading, this was money well spent. A chart that helped a navigator avoid a dangerous reef, find a safe harbor before a storm, or accurately plot a course across open water could easily pay for itself many times over in a single voyage. The charts were working tools, used in conditions that were far from ideal, exposed to salt spray, studied by lamplight and rolling ships, marked up with notes and corrections as pilots gained new information. Many charts show evidence of heavy use, stains, wear patterns, annotations at multiple hands. The fact that any survived at all is somewhat miraculous. Most were literally used until they fell apart, then replaced with newer versions incorporating updated information. The portolan chart tradition gradually expanded.
The impact of portolan charts on broader cartographic development was profound, though gradual. The accurate framework they provided for Mediterranean and nearby Atlantic coasts became the foundation onto which interior details could be added as that information became available. Some cartographers attempted to combine portolan-style coastal accuracy with Mappa Mundi-style world coverage, creating hybrid maps that showed recognizable Mediterranean coastlines but located them within theoretical global frameworks. By the 15th century, these influences began producing world maps that retained theological and classical elements, but grounded them in empirically accurate geography where such information existed. Ptolemy's geography, rediscovered in the West in the early 15th century, provided another source of geographical information, and cartographers sometimes struggled to reconcile Ptolemaic ordinates with portolan chart evidence. Usually, when they conflicted, the portolan information prevailed for regions the charts covered, suggesting that even theoretically minded scholars recognized the empirical superiority of these practical navigation tools. In the golden light of late afternoon, Visconti stands back from his work, critically examining the nearly complete charts spread across his workbench. The Mediterranean sprawls across the vellum in instantly recognizable form, Italy's distinctive boot, the islands of Sicily and Sardinia and Corsica positioned with careful accuracy, the complex coastlines of Greece and Asia Minor, the Adriatic's narrow reach northward, the Black Sea extending eastward. The geometric web of rhumb lines transforms the geographical representation into a navigational tool, overlaying the natural shapes of lands and seas with the human-made framework of directional sailing. This combination, natural geography rendered with empirical precision and mathematical framework imposed for practical utility, exemplifies the portolan chart's unique character as both representation of the world and tool for moving through it. The social networks that supported portolan chart making extended throughout the Mediterranean maritime world. Visconti corresponds with fellow cartographers in other cities, exchanging information and sometimes even collaborating on large or specialized charts. He maintains contacts with ship's pilots, who provide him with corrections and new information, a reef whose position was slightly mismarked on earlier charts, a newly opened harbor, changes in coastal features resulting from storms or silting. He knows merchants who commission charts for their trading ventures, ship owners who want the best available navigational aids for their vessels, nobles who collect charts as prestigious objects displaying their sophistication and cosmopolitan interests. This network of production, use, and exchange created a feedback system that continuously improved chart accuracy. Unlike ancient geographical texts that remained static once written, portolan charts evolved constantly, incorporating new information into an ever more accurate representation of the maritime Mediterranean. The workshop itself is a carefully organized space reflecting the requirements of chart making. The large workbench positioned to catch the best natural light, storage cabinets containing prepared vellum and finished charts, shelves holding reference materials, earlier charts, pilot books, notes from correspondence with mariners and merchants. The tools of the trade hang on wall hooks or rest in designated spots, various sizes of dividers and compasses for geometric construction, straight edges and rulers, quills and pens, scrapers and knives for preparing vellum and making corrections. Pigments and inks occupy one area, organized by color, lamp black and iron gall ink for black, verdigris for green, vermilion for red, ultramarine made from precious lapis lazuli for the finest blue details, gold leaf for illuminated elements. A lodestone compass serves as reference for establishing orientation, though Visconti, after decades of chart making, can draw compass roses so true that they could themselves serve as navigation instruments. The economy of medieval Mediterranean maritime trade provided the context and impetus for portolan chart development. Venice and Genoa, the great merchant republics, competed fiercely for commercial dominance, and superior navigation capabilities provided real competitive advantage. A Venetian merchant fleet that could sail more direct routes with greater confidence, that wasted less time in uncertain navigation or arrived in better condition after avoiding hazards, would generate higher profits than rivals dependent on less accurate charts or less systematic navigational methods. The chart makers served this competitive commercial world, and the best among them became wealthy, respected figures in their city's economic elite. The charts they produced were commercial products in a sophisticated market economy, their value determined by the accuracy and detail they provided, and by the reputation of the workshop that created them. This commercial context meant that unlike academic or religious cartography, portolan chart making was subject to market discipline. Charts that didn't work, that led ships astray, would quickly destroy a cartographer's reputation and livelihood. Visconti adds final touches to his compass roses, carefully applying gold leaf to the primary
primary rose's most prominent elements. The technique requires patience and steady hands. The thin gold leaf adheres to size previously applied to the vellum, but it's delicate, easily torn or wrinkled. When properly applied and burnished, though, it creates an effect of remarkable richness, the gold catching light and seeming to glow. This decorative element, while not strictly necessary for the chart's navigational function, adds significant value. A chart adorned with gold leaf is a prestige object, suitable for presentation to an important patron or for display in a wealthy merchant's residence as a symbol of sophistication and international commercial connections. Some charts were clearly made primarily for display rather than shipboard use. Their decoration is more elaborate, their vellum finer, their condition suggesting they were never exposed to the harsh marine environment but instead remained in protected, prestigious settings. The mystery of portolan charts' origins remains unresolved despite centuries of scholarly investigation. The absence of evolutionary precursors, the sudden appearance of fully formed techniques, the extraordinary accuracy that seems to exceed what we'd expect from medieval navigational capabilities, all these factors have generated numerous theories. Some scholars suggest Byzantine origins, notably that the Roman and Byzantine empires maintained sophisticated maritime cultures that might have developed these techniques, with knowledge preserved in practical rather than literary context, until being adopted and systematized by Italian chart makers. Others point to possible Arab sources, given Islamic civilizations' advanced mathematical and astronomical knowledge and extensive maritime trade networks. The truth may be that portolan charts represent a synthesis of techniques from multiple sources, Byzantine, Arab, Italian, combined with indigenous Mediterranean seafaring traditions extending back to Phoenician and Greek antiquity. The chart's sudden documentation in the historical record might reflect not their invention, but rather the moment when a previously oral and practical tradition was finally captured in lasting form. The terminology used on portolan charts reveals much about medieval maritime culture. Many place names appear in multiple linguistic forms, reflecting the cosmopolitan character of Mediterranean trade. The naming of winds and directions follow traditional patterns that vary regionally. Italian nomenclature often differs from Catalan or Provençal, yet chart makers had to standardize to some degree for charts to be usable across linguistic boundaries. Some charts include annotations in multiple languages, suggesting that creators anticipated use by navigators of different origins. The dense concentration of names along heavily trafficked coasts, with some sections containing dozens of place names within a few centimeters, demonstrates both the importance of these regions and the chart maker's comprehensive knowledge. Some locations receive multiple names, their current designation plus historical or alternative names, helping navigators who might know a place by different terms. This multilingual, culturally hybrid character of portolan charts nomenclature mirrors the Mediterranean's nature as a zone of interaction and exchange rather than a simple boundary between distinct civilizations. As evening approaches and the light in Visconti's workshop begins to fade, he carefully rolls the completed chart, interleaving it with clean paper to protect the surface, and stores it in a cabinet to allow the inks to fully dry before delivery to the merchant who commissioned it. Tomorrow he'll begin another chart, the process repeating with the rhythms of practiced expertise. Yet each chart is unique, incorporating the most recent information he's received, reflecting subtle improvements in his technique, responding to the specific requirements of its intended user. Some clients want coverage extending to the Black Sea for trading ventures in Genoese colonies. Others prioritize the Western Mediterranean for commerce with North Africa and Iberia. Some request larger-scale charts focusing on particular regions for coastal trading. Others prefer comprehensive charts showing the entire Mediterranean at smaller scale for long-distance routes. This customization, this tailoring of charts to specific navigational needs, distinguishes portolan chart making from the reproduction of standard geographical texts, and underscores their nature as practical, user-focused tools rather than theoretical representations. The broader epistemological significance of portolan charts can hardly be overstated. They represent an empirical revolution in geographical knowledge, a shift from authority-based cosmography to observation-based cartography. While medieval scholars at universities debated the size of the Earth and the theoretical habitability of southern latitudes based on ancient texts, Mediterranean pilots were systematically mapping actual coastlines with stunning precision based on direct observation and accumulated practical experience. This bottom-up approach to knowledge-making, privileging what works or what authorities claim, what can be verified through repeated observation over what conforms to theoretical expectations, anticipates the scientific method's emphasis on empiricism and falsifiability. A portolan chart that misrepresented a coastline would be corrected not through textual analysis or theoretical debate, but through navigational experience. Pilots who found the charting edge would report the errors, and cartographers would modify subsequent charts accordingly. This feedback mechanism, grounded in real-world testing of geographical claims, created a self-correcting system that progressively improved accuracy in ways that purely textual or theoretical geographical traditions could not match. The technical debates surrounding portolan charts continue among historians of cartography, geography, and navigation. How exactly were the charts constructed? Did cartographers use some form of measured survey, or were they synthesizing information from pilot books and verbal reports? How are distances standardized when different regions use different measures, and when estimates of distance at sea varied with wind conditions and ship types? How did chart makers handle the problem of representing a spherical Earth on flat vellum? Were they aware of projection issues, and if so, what solutions did they employ? Analysis of surviving charts shows that they generally use what modern cartographers would call an approximate plane chart projection, treating the relatively small area of the Mediterranean as essentially flat. This works reasonably well for the Mediterranean's limited east-west extent and mid-latitude position, though it introduces growing distortions that extended much beyond this region. The fact that portolan chart techniques didn't successfully transfer to global mapping, Portuguese and Spanish explorations required development of new projections and techniques for accurately representing long ocean voyages, spanning many degrees of latitude, suggested portolan chart makers were expert practitioners, whose methods worked brilliantly for their specific geographical focus, but were not based on theoretical cartographical principles that could be systematically extended to larger scales. The artistic development of portolan charts over time shows evolving aesthetic sensibilities, while core functional elements remain remarkably consistent. 14th century charts tend toward relatively spare decoration, their beauty deriving from the elegant geometry of rhumb lines and the careful calligraphy of grist names. 15th century charts often incorporate more elaborate decoration, more detailed city illustrations, decorative compass roses, ornamental borders, sometimes interior illustrations of rulers or exotic animals in blank spaces away from coasts. Some 16th century charts, particularly those made in centers like Dieppe in France, become highly decorative objects where artistic embellishment rivals or even exceed color clarity. This evolution reflects partly the development of charts as prestige objects and collectibles rather than solely as navigational tools, and partly the influence of other cartographical traditions as portolan techniques merged with emerging printed map production and the decorative conventions of Renaissance cartography. Yet even the most elaborately decorated charts maintain the fundamental elements, accurate coastlines, comprehensive place names, rhumb line networks, that define the portolan tradition. The transmission of chart-making knowledge involved both formal and informal education. Sons learned from fathers in family workshops, apprenticed from trained under masters in guild-regulated systems, and presumably some degree of industrial espionage occurred as chartmakers attempted to discover rivals' techniques and information sources. The lack of theoretical treatises explaining portolan chart-making methods until quite late in the tradition's development suggested knowledge was transmitted primarily through demonstration, practice, rather than through written instruction. This practical, craft-based mode of knowledge transmission was typical of medieval skill traits generally, but it means that modern scholars must reconstruct portolan techniques through analysis of surviving charts rather than some contemporary explanatory texts. The earliest known discussion of portolan chart construction appears in the early 16th century, by which time the tradition was already several centuries old. This temporal gap between practice and theoretical explanation illustrates how expertise can develop and be effectively transmitted without formal theoretical explanation. Medieval pilots and chartsmakers knew how to navigate and make charts long before anyone systematically described these processes in theoretical terms. Vesconte's career represents the professionalization of cartography as a specialized occupation, distinct from the broader practice of mechanization or any religious. Earlier charts have been engraved by Sitzlein.
In the cartographic imagination of pre-modern civilizations, the boundary between known and unknown was never simply a line on a map. It was a threshold, a frontier where empirical observation dissolved into cultural mythology, where the scientific impulse to catalog and measure gave way to the human need to populate empty spaces with meaning. When medieval European cartographers inscribed warnings in the blank territories beyond their knowledge, when Chinese map makers filled distant lands with tribute-bearing foreigners, when Islamic scholars positioned Gog and Magog behind Alexander's legendary wall, they were not simply acknowledging ignorance, they were transforming absence into presence, converting the anxiety of the unknown into narratives their cultures could comprehend and control. The phrase, "here be dragons," though vastly less common on historical maps than popular imagination suggests, has become emblematic of this cartographic tendency to mythologize the unmapped. In reality, the exact phrase appears on almost no surviving maps, with the Hunt-Lennox globe of circa 1510 bearing the Latin HCSUNT Dracones as a rare, genuine example. Yet the cultural persistence of this notion reveals something profound about how we understand pre-modern cartography. Whether the warning read, "Here be dragons," or "Here be lions," or simply depicted sea serpents writhing through uncharted waters, these annotations and illustrations served multiple functions simultaneously. They marked danger, certainly, but they also marked transition zones between empirical geography and cultural imagination, between what could be observed and what must be inferred, between the comfortable familiarity of home territories and the threatening strangeness of distant lands. The mythological populations of ancient and medieval maps formed a consistent bestiary across cultures, though the specific creatures varied according to local traditions and received authorities. European maps drew heavily from classical sources, particularly Pliny the Elder's natural history and the bestiaries that synthesized classical knowledge with Christian interpretation. These sources provided the Cynophali, the dog-headed men, reliably placed in distant Asia or Africa, whose existence was debated by serious scholars for centuries. Augustine of Hippo himself pondered whether such creatures, if they existed, possessed souls that descended from Adam. The cyopods or monopods, one-legged beings who used their single enormous foot as a parasol against the sun, appeared in manuscripts and maps from the medieval period through the Renaissance, gradually migrating eastward on maps as Western territories became better known and obviously lacking in such creatures. The blemmies, headless beings with faces on their chests, populated the uncertain interiors of Africa and later South America, representing perhaps the ultimate expression of radical human difference. Their persistence in cartographic tradition reveals how mythological geography functioned. These creatures occupied a space between possible and impossible, strange enough to mark the genuine otherness of distant lands, yet not so fantastical as to be immediately dismissed. They existed in a realm of plausibility that actual travel and exploration would eventually collapse, but until that moment of empirical verification, they served as placeholders for the genuine mystery of what might exist beyond known boundaries. The Amazons, warrior women ruling kingdoms without men, represent a different category of cartographic mythology, one rooted in ancient Greek tradition but continuously relocated as geographic knowledge expanded. Herodotus placed them in Scythia, medieval maps positioned them in Eastern Europe or Central Asia, Renaissance cartography
cartographers moved them to Africa, and the Spanish conquistadors, upon encountering the great rivers of South America defended by indigenous warriors, gave one river the name it retains today. The Amazon myth's remarkable persistence and mobility illustrate how cartographic mythology served cultural functions beyond simple geographic description. The Amazons represented anxieties about gender order, fantasies of female power, and the possibility that familiar social structures might be radically inverted in distant lands. Their consistent placement at the margins of known geography marked them as liminal figures, existing at the boundary between civilization and chaos. No cartographic mythology proved more persistent or consequential than the legend of Prester John, the supposed Christian monarch ruling a vast and wealthy empire somewhere in the east. This legend, emerging in the 12th century from a probably fabricated letter purporting to be from this priest-king, captured the European imagination with peculiar intensity. Maps for centuries hopefully located Prester John's kingdom, first in Central Asia, later in Ethiopia, as a potential ally against Islam's expansion and a source of the exotic wealth that fueled commercial ambitions. The search for Prester John motivated genuine exploration, influenced diplomatic missions, and shaped European understanding of African and Asian geography for half a millennium. What made the Prester John legend particularly revealing was its combination of religious hope, military strategic thinking, and economic desire. The myth promised that somewhere beyond the Islamic world that separated Christian Europe from the East, there existed a powerful Christian ally, fantastically wealthy, militarily formidable, ready to join in crusade. This was wishful thinking translated into cartographic certainty, with maps marking Prester John's realm with the same apparent authority they brought to depicting Sicily or Spain. The gradual disillusionment came in stages. Portuguese exploration of Africa's coasts found sophisticated kingdoms and complex societies, but not the legendary Christian empire of fable. When European emissaries finally reached Ethiopia, they found a genuinely Christian civilization, but not the fantasy realm of unlimited wealth and power they had imagined. The cartographic retreat of Prester John from maps tracked the painful replacement of European desire with African reality. The mythological content of maps reveals the cultures that created them with startling clarity. Chinese cartographic traditions populated peripheral territories with foreign tribute bearers, emphasizing the empire's centrality and civilizing mission. These maps presented a vision of cosmic order, with the Son of Heaven at the center and peripheral peoples oriented toward that center in postures of submission and admiration. The mythological elements in Chinese maps, when they appeared, tended toward the symbolic rather than the monstrous: auspicious animals indicating virtuous rule, geographic features associated with legendary sage kings, boundaries marked by culturally significant rather than physically monstrous guardians. Islamic cartographic traditions, with their sophisticated synthesis of Greek geographic knowledge, Quranic cosmology, and observations from extensive travel and trade networks, positioned mythological elements within a religious framework. Gog and Magog, the apocalyptic forces mentioned in Quran and Christian Bible alike, appeared on maps behind the wall Alexander the Great supposedly constructed to contain them. Their placement marked eschatological geography, territories that would become significant at the end of time, thus integrating sacred history with spatial representation. The mythological geography of Islamic maps often served to reconcile classical authorities, particularly Ptolemy, with Quranic revelation and the observed reality of extensive Muslim travel and commerce. European Christian maps, particularly the medieval Mappa Mundi that adorned churches and manuscripts, presented geographic space as fundamentally theological. The Hereford Mappa Mundi, created around 1300 and still preserved in Hereford Cathedral, exemplifies this integration of geography, history, and salvation narrative. Jerusalem sits at the world's center, Eden at the eastern top, and the margins teem with the monstrous races described by classical and medieval authorities. These creatures are not simply decorative or cautionary, they are part of God's creation, evidence of divine imagination and power, challenges to human understanding that ultimately glorify the Creator's infinite variety. The map's geographic content is inseparable from its function as a visual encyclopedia of salvation history and natural philosophy. The practical functions of cartographic mythology extended beyond religious or cultural expression. Sea monsters on nautical charts, while certainly decorative, also served as warnings of hazardous waters, with their placement often corresponding to areas of known dangers like reefs, currents, or frequent storms. The exaggerated depictions of exotic animals in African and Asian interiors communicated real information about wildlife, however fantastically rendered. The monstrous races, while often entirely fictional, existed on a continuum with genuine reports of unfamiliar customs, peoples, and environments that seemed almost impossible to those who had never traveled beyond their local regions. The transmission process from travelers' observations to cartographic representation reveals how mythology and reality intertwined. Marco Polo's account of his travels, dictated to a romance writer while both were imprisoned in Genoa, combined genuine observation with received legend, personal experience with secondhand reports, all filtered through the expectations and narrative conventions of medieval travel literature. When cartographers attempted to map Polo's described territories, they faced the challenge of distinguishing observation from exaggeration, fact from embellishment, in a text that made no clear distinctions. The result were maps that depicted real places like the Mongol Empire's extent, alongside fantastic elements from Polo's account or from other sources assumed to describe the same regions. The cartographic interpretation of travelers' tales created a feedback loop that reinforced mythological elements. A traveler might report that certain distant peoples practiced unusual customs, a report that in transmission and translation became more exotic, which cartographers then represented familiar visual short-handed monstrous races, which in turn shaped the expectations of subsequent travelers. This process created self-reinforcing cartographic mythologies that could persist for generations, requiring direct, sustained contact to dislodge.
The artistic and commercial dimensions of cartographic mythology deserve recognition alongside their cultural and epistemological functions. Maps were valuable objects, and their value derived partly from their information content, but equally from their visual appeal and the artistic skill of their execution. The elaborate sea monsters of 16th century Dutch maps by cartographers like Ortiz or Blay were demonstrates that the mapmaker's artistic signification and the map owner's refined taste. The engraved or painted creatures transformed functional navigation tools into objects of beauty and status, appropriate for display in wealthy homes and institutions. The artistic freedom that mythological content allowed mapmakers served another function. It filled empty spaces. A map with large blank regions seemed incomplete, unfinished, even if those blank regions more accurately represented the limits of geographic knowledge. The human eye and mind find blank space uncomfortable, particularly in a rectangular frame that implies completeness. Mythological creatures, fantastical kingdoms, and decorative cartouches solve this aesthetic problem. I don't feel one moment here, but we acknowledge something lost here. It was a form of epistemological honesty, paradoxically, rendered through fantastic imagery. The gradual retreat of mythology from maps tracks the expansion of European exploration and the corresponding epistemological shift toward empiricism. Portuguese navigation of Africa's coast in the 15th century systematically replaced cartographic speculation with observed coastline. Each voyage pushed the boundary of accurate mapping further, and in its wake, mythological content receded. Our maps did show Prestigions Ampere or the King of the Amazons. The Portuguese trust showed observed harbors, measured distances, recorded landmarks. It was just gradual and uneven, with mythological content persisting in interiors long after coastlines had been accurately mapped, but the direction was consistent. Yet the retreat of old mythologies created space for new ones. The Spanish conquest of the Americas displaced one set of cartographic fantasies, but generated others. El Dorado, the legendary Golden City, became a persistent feature of South American cartography, motivating expeditions, shaping colonial policy, and appearing on maps with varying degrees of certainty for centuries. The myth drew on genuine indigenous ceremonies, particularly the Muisca traditions, counting a new ruler in a gold dust, but transformed this ritual into a place, a city or kingdom of infinite wealth waiting to be discovered. Multiple expeditions mounting to sustain military ventures sought El Dorado in the 16th and 17th centuries, finding instead the Amazon rainforest, the Orinoco River system, and various indigenous peoples, but never the Golden City of legend. The Northwest Passage, the supposed navigable route through the Arctic connecting Atlantic and Pacific, functioned as a similar mythological geography in northern latitudes. Unlike the monstrous races or fantastical kingdoms, the Northwest Passage was plausible from a geographic standpoint, and some version of it did ultimately exist, though not in navigable form until modernized conditions changed. Yet the search for it acquired mythological dimensions. Expeditions persisted despite repeated failures. Maps showed various proposed routes with confidence despite lack of evidence, and the commercial and strategic importance associated with the passage far exceeded any realistic assessment. The Franklin expedition's catastrophic loss in 1845 and the subsequent searches that found only frozen corpses, men, and in ships represented the collision of cartographic mythology with Arctic reality. The transition from mythological to empirical cartography involved more than simply removal of fantastical creatures and legendary kingdoms. It represented a fundamental shift in how maps acknowledge France. Medieval and Renaissance approach populated unknown regions with possibilities, however fantastical, maintaining narrative continuity across the map's entire surface. The modern scientific approach increasingly marked unknown regions as simply blank or labeled them terra ignotica, undersimilar, or similar admissions of absence. This shift reflected broader changes in intellectual culture, the rise of empiricism in the scientific method, the increasing distinction between observed fact and received authority, the growing discomfort with uncertainty and speculation in scientific discourse. We can observe this transition clearly in maps of Africa's interior, comparing 16th century maps showing kingdoms, rivers, mountains, and African peoples on classical sources and secondhand reports with 19th century maps that leave vast blank spaces marked as unculled, exploited by records of intercontact. The later maps were honest in a sense, acknowledging the limits of European geographic knowledge, but they also represented a contraction of confidence. The earlier maps asserted a completeness of knowledge that proved false, but they maintained a vision of Africa as populated, organized, and comprehensible, however inaccurately. The later blank spaces, well more scientifically rigorous, also represented Africa as empty, unknown, available for European imagination and eventual compensation. The removal of mythology maps came with costs as well as benefits. The accuracy gained is
Certain cartographic mythologies had profound consequences for the peoples who occupied the territories in question. The myth of terra nullius, the legal fiction that Australia was empty and unclaimed before European arrival, functioned as a form of cartographic mythology that denied the existence and sovereignty of indigenous peoples. This was not a matter of dog-headed men or sea monsters, but rather a mythological absence, a strategic non-representation that served colonial purposes. Similarly, the mapping of African and American interiors as blank, savage, or chaotic justified European colonization as a civilizing mission. These absences and distortions functioned mythologically, even while claiming empirical authority, showing that the transition to scientific cartography did not eliminate mythology, but sometimes transformed it into different forms. The commercial motivations behind cartographic mythology extend beyond the aesthetic appeal of decorated maps. Myths of wealthy kingdoms and abundant resources motivated exploration and investment. The Spice Islands, while real, acquired mythological dimensions in European imagination, depicted as places of inexhaustible wealth and exotic abundance. These representations attracted capital, ships, and sailors to dangerous ventures, with the cartographic mythology serving commercial promotion. Maps became marketing materials for exploration companies, colonial ventures, and trade enterprises, with their mythological content carefully calibrated to attract investment, while maintaining some relationship to credibility. The persistence of certain mythological elements despite contrary evidence reveals the power of cartographic authority. Once a feature appeared on widely circulated maps, particularly maps from prestigious cartographers, it could remain through multiple editions and copies even after it had been disproven. The cartographic mutation, whereby California appeared as an island on 17th and 18th century European maps, despite Spanish knowledge that it was a peninsula, shows how map-making communities could collectively embrace error. The mistake originated from a misunderstanding or misrepresentation, but once established in influential maps, it reproduced across the cartographic tradition, with contrary evidence slow to overcome the authority of prestigious precedent. The religious dimensions of cartographic mythology operated at multiple levels. Christian maps placed Jerusalem at the world's center, not from geographic measurement, but from theological conviction. Paradise, the Garden of Eden, appeared at the eastern edge of medieval maps, sometimes as a walled garden, sometimes as an island, representing both a historical location and a spiritual state. The antipodes, the theoretical region on Earth's opposite side, generated theological controversy. If lands existed there, were they inhabited? If inhabited, did those people descend from Adam? Were they affected by Christ's salvation? These questions shaped cartographic decisions about whether and how to represent Southern Hemisphere lands, with theology influencing geography as much as observation. Islamic cartography similarly integrated religious understanding with spatial representation, but with different emphases and different mythological content. The direction to Mecca, essential for prayer, influenced map orientation and the representation of the Islamic world. The pilgrimage routes to the holy cities acquired special significance, mapped with particular attention. The cosmological geography of Quranic accounts shaped the representation of the world's structure and extent. The integration of religious and geographic knowledge in Islamic cartography was not a failure of scientific thinking, but rather a different epistemological framework, one that modern distinctions between religious and secular knowledge did not assume. The tension between Ptolemaic geographic authority and empirical observation created its own form of cartographic mythology. Ptolemy's geography, recovered in Europe in the 15th century, provided a systematic framework for world mapping based on ancient knowledge. For Renaissance cartographers, this authoritative text presented a dilemma when it conflicted with more recent observations. Should they trust the ancient authority or the modern report? Different mapmakers resolved this differently, with some maps attempting to integrate both, creating hybrid representations that combine Ptolemaic geography with updated coastlines or inland features. These hybrid maps represented a transitional mythology, attempting to honor received authority while accommodating new knowledge. The cartographic representation of Antarctica offers a curious case study in mythology and knowledge. Ancient and medieval geographic theory posited a southern landmass, Terra Australis, required for global balance and symmetry. This theoretical continent appeared on maps long before any evidence of Antarctica's existence, growing and shrinking according to theoretical convictions rather than observation. When actual exploration gradually revealed Antarctic coastlines in the 19th century, they partially confirmed but substantially corrected the mythological Terra Australis. The continent existed, but not as the theorist had imagined, and in a location and form the theory had not predicted. This case shows how cartographic mythology could accidentally approximate reality while remaining fundamentally speculative. The artistic conventions for representing mythological content evolved over time and varied by region and cartographic tradition. Northern European engraved maps of the 16th and 17th centuries developed elaborate Baroque styles for sea monsters and decorative cartouches, with the creatures shown in dramatic action, breaching waves or battling ships. These engravings demonstrated artistic virtuosity and made maps into exhibition pieces. In contrast, manuscript maps often rendered mythological content more simply, with creatures drawn from bestiary traditions in flatter, more iconic styles. Islamic maps used different visual vocabularies, with geometric decoration and calligraphic text replacing pictorial monsters. Chinese maps employed brushwork techniques and iconographic traditions from painting, representing mythological content within those aesthetic frameworks. The decline of mythological content from printed maps occurred earlier than from manuscript maps, reflecting different functions and audiences. Printed maps, particularly nautical charts for actual navigation, faced practical pressure to maximize accuracy and utility, making mythological content less acceptable. Manuscript maps, often produced for wealthy patrons or institutional settings, retained decorative and mythological elements under as their function was as much symbolic and aesthetic as practical. This divergence shows how mythology's retreat was not simply a matter of increasing knowledge, but also reflected changing social context for maps and their uses. The relationship between cartographic mythology and contemporary fantasy is worth considering. The medieval mapmaker depicting dog-headed men did not consider himself a fantasy artist, but rather someone depicting distant realities based on received authorities and travelers' reports. The distinction between fantasy and reality was differently drawn, with the category of the impossible more narrow than modern skepticism would allow. What seems like mythology to us was, in many cases, natural philosophy to them, an attempt to catalog the full range of creation's diversity. The decline of the cartographic mythology thus represents not just better information, but a narrowing of what counts as possible, a restriction of a category of the potentially real. The political uses of cartographic mythology extended beyond the commercial and religious. Mythological elements could assert territorial claims, with the placement of a kingdom or the direction of a river implies sovereignty and control. The depiction of peoples as monstrous or savage provided justification for conquest and conversion. The mapping of blank spaces as empty implied availability for settlement and exploitation. As European empires expanded, these mythological or strategic cartographic choices had
concrete political consequences, affecting how colonial authorities understood and governed territories, how they allocated resources, and how they treated indigenous populations. The transition moments when mythological content disappeared from maps of specific regions offer revealing case studies. The Portuguese mapping of Brazil's coast eliminated sea monsters from those waters by the mid-16th century, replaced with observed harbors and landmarks. The interior remained mysterious and mythologically rich for centuries longer. North America's eastern seaboard was demythologized by the early 17th century, but the continent's interior retained mythological content, particularly the elusive water passage to the Pacific well into the 19th century. Each region's cartographic demythologization tracked the extent and intensity of European contact and colonization, with the process generally moving from coast inland from trading ports outward. The question of whether indigenous knowledge systems would count as mythology requires careful consideration. When Aboriginal Australian songlines encode geographic knowledge and spiritual significance simultaneously, is this mythology or an alternative epistemological framework? When Polynesian navigators use star paths, wave patterns, and traditional narratives to cross vast ocean expanses, are their oral maps mythological or sophisticated wayfinding systems? The classification of indigenous geographic knowledge as mythology often reflects European assumptions about proper knowledge, rather than the actual content or effectiveness of that knowledge. Modern cartography is increasingly recognizing that the elimination of indigenous spatial knowledge in favor of European empirical mapping represented a loss as well as a gain. The legacy of cartographic mythology persists in modern context. Tourist maps populate regions with illustrated attractions and cultural symbols, creating modern mythological geographies that guide visitor expectations and experiences. Fantasy literature and games create elaborate maps with their own mythological content, self-consciously recreating the aesthetic and imaginative appeal of pre-modern geography. Popular culture's fascination with ancient maps and their mythological elements, evident in films, books, and games, suggests continuing appeal of geography infused with narrative and imagination rather than strictly empirical representation. The scientific revolution's impact on cartography extended beyond methodology to affect the social position of mapmakers. Medieval and Renaissance mapmakers were often scholars, scribes, or artists, working with traditions that valued classical authority and artistic achievement. The shift toward empirical cartography cultivated the status of surveyors, navigators, and explorers, those with direct observational experience, while reducing the authority of those working from text and traditions. This social transformation within cartographic practice paralleled the broader elevation of empirical scientists over scholastic authorities, contributing to mythology's retreat from maps. The speed of mythological retreat varied by region and political context. Colonial territories under intensive European exploitation saw rapid replacement of mythological content with survey geography, driven by commercial and military needs for accurate maps. Regions of less immediate interest retain mythological content longer, with cartographers continuing to reproduce received content in the absence of updated information. Some mythological elements proved remarkably persistent, appearing in 19th century maps despite centuries of contrary evidence, showing that cartographic mythology could outlive any reasonable belief in its accuracy, maintained by tradition and the self-replicating nature of map conjuging. The aesthetic dimensions of this transition deserve attention. The crowded, symbolically rich maps of the medieval and Renaissance period, with their elaborate cartouches, monster-filled seas, and decorated margins, gradually gave way to cleaner, more austere modern maps focused on topographic information. This aesthetic shift reflected changing values from maps as comprehensive visual encyclopedias to maps as specialized information tools. The loss of decorative content made maps more readable for navigation and practical use, but less rich as cultural artifacts. Modern map design has partially recovered decorative elements, but within the framework of empirical accuracy, and magical imagination. The role of error in the history of cartographic mythology complicates simple narratives from ignorance to knowledge. Many elements we categorize as mythological were genuine attempts to map reported phenomena, with the errors arising from misunderstanding, mistranslation, or exaggeration of real observations rather than pure fantasy. The dog-headed cinephaly might have originated from encounters with baboons or peoples with unfamiliar languages whose speech sounded animal-like. The one-footed Cyapathus may represent a misunderstood description of people hopping or using peculiar footwear. These mythological elements exist in a gray zone between observation and imagination, showing how cultural frameworks shape perception and transmission of geographic information. The question of what modern cartography's equivalent mythologies might be invites reflection. Are the precisely drawn borders between nations, often cutting through territories with no regard for geography or indigenous boundaries, a form of modern cartographic mythology? Is the representation of the nation-state as the natural and primary unit of political geography a mythological framework we have naturalized? Do thematic maps showing economic or demographic data create their own mythologies through choices about what to represent and how? The critical examination of contemporary cartography suggests that the transition from mythological to scientific mapping did not eliminate mythology, or rather changed its forms and made it less visible. The emotional and psychological functions of cartographic mythology deserve consideration alongside the cultural and practical. The known world felt less lonely, less empty, when the unknown regions were populated with creatures and kingdoms, however fantastic. The mythological content provided narrative continuity, connecting the familiar territories of home with the mysterious regions beyond through gradations of strangeness. The complete elimination of this mythological content, the transition to blank spaces and unexplored labels, might be more honest but also more psychologically alienating, presenting a world that extends beyond knowledge into mere absence. The connection between cartographic mythology and the history of wonder is profound. The monstrous races, the fantastic kingdoms, the sea serpents and dragons all contributed to a sense of the world as marvelous, as containing possibilities beyond ordinary experience. The elimination of these elements from maps contributed to what Max Weber called the disenchantment of the world, the removal of magic, mystery, and wonder from modern experience. This is the bittersweet recognition that concludes this exploration. We gain accuracy, but lost a dimension of human engagement with the world, of willingness to populate the unknown with imagination, to maintain wonder in the face of ignorance. The legacy of cartographic mythology influences how we think about the unknown today. The phrase "here be dragons," whether historical or not, persists because it captures something true about human responses to uncertainty. When we map the ocean floors or distant planets, we bring the same tension between empirical observation and imaginative projection, but we have learned to mark the distinction more clearly. When we create maps of the future through predictive models and scenarios, we engage in a form of cartographic mythology, populating unknown temporal territories with the projected possibilities. The study of cartographic mythology ultimately